My husband Trevor had strictly forbidden me from ever visiting his upstate farm. He called it a toxic, rotting money pit that was completely unsafe. But days after his sudden death, his estate lawyer handed me a heavy high-tech key fob and told me not to sign away the property until I saw it for myself. I expected a crumbling shack, but when I pressed the button on that fob and the iron gate swung open, I completely lost my breath. What was hidden on that property would destroy everything my in-laws stood for. My name is Jillian, and I am 33 years old. I spent the last 6 years of my life married to a man who was living a massive lie. If you have ever been gaslit by the very people who were supposed to be your family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against those who tried to take everything from you. The air in our house was thick with the scent of white lilies and the muted murmur of fake sympathy. We had just laid Trevor to rest exactly 3 hours earlier. I was standing in my own kitchen staring blankly at the smooth marble countertop. My body felt incredibly heavy with a grief that was entirely suffocating. I had barely slept a single hour since receiving that terrible late-night phone call about his fatal car accident. My hands were trembling violently as I poured myself a glass of cold water. I was just hoping for one single minute of peace, away from the crowded living room full of whispering mourners. I wanted to close my eyes and wake up from this nightmare. But peace is a luxury my mother-in-law, Francine, never allowed me to have. The heavy wooden kitchen door swung shut abruptly and muffled the constant chatter of the reception outside. Francine marched into the room. Her black designer morning dress was impeccably crisp, and her face was completely devoid of any actual sorrow. She did not offer me a comforting hug. She did not ask how I was holding up on the hardest day of my life. Instead, she walked straight up to me and slammed a thick manila folder onto the kitchen island right in front of my water glass. "Sign the quitclaim deed for the upstate farm, Gillian," Francine ordered. Her voice was sharp and commanding, leaving absolutely no room for discussion. "Harrison is taking over the financial burden, and we need this done today." I blinked repeatedly and tried to process her demanding words through the thick fog of grief in my brain. The upstate farm. Trevor had bought that property 4 years ago. He always referred to it as his hunting camp. He told me it was a cheap and dilapidated plot of land he picked up at a county tax auction for next to nothing. He had absolutely forbade me from ever going up there to see it. He told me the soil was highly toxic from old chemical dumps, and the cabin was infested with dangerous black mold. He swore the foundation was structurally unsafe and could collapse at any minute. It was his private project, a place he claimed he went to do grueling physical labor just to clear his head away from the city. Whenever I offered to help him fix it up, he would turn vicious and berate me for nagging him about his only private sanctuary. I had learned to simply stop asking about it to keep the peace in our marriage. Before I could even formulate a question to ask Francine, the kitchen door swung open once again. Trevor's older brother Harrison strolled into the room. Harrison was the undisputed golden child of the family. He could do absolutely no wrong in Francine's eyes, despite a long string of failed business ventures that my in-laws always quietly covered up with their own money. Harrison leaned casually against my refrigerator and swirled a glass of expensive bourbon that he had boldly helped himself to from my private liquor cabinet. He looked me up and down with a familiar and deeply condescending smirk that I had endured for 6 long years. "Come on, Jillian." Harrison sneered and took a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. Trevor was drowning in massive debt because he was constantly funding your pathetic little plant shop. We all know it." I stiffened and felt a hot flash of defensive anger cut through my sadness. My botanical nursery was not a pathetic little plant shop. It was a highly successful and high-end business that I had built completely from the ground up with my own 2 hands. I provided rare orchids and custom living terrariums to luxury hotels and elite corporate clients across the entire state. I had never taken a single dime from Trevor to run my business. In fact, my steady income often covered our mortgage and household expenses. When Trevor claimed his annual corporate bonuses were delayed or smaller than expected, But in the eyes of my arrogant in-laws, my thriving career was just a cute little hobby for a housewife. It was considered utterly inferior to Harrison's supposed corporate genius, even though Harrison had never successfully managed a profitable company in his entire life. "Trevor died penniless, Jillian," Francine said. Her tone dripped with a fake, sickening pity that barely masked her venomous intent. "He was hiding the terrible truth from you to protect you. That toxic property upstate is a massive financial liability. The property taxes and the code violations alone are going to completely bankrupt you by the end of the year. We are just trying to help you. Harrison is graciously willing to take the deed off your hands today so you do not lose everything you own. You need to sign it right now to keep this family out of total financial ruin." The sheer audacity of cornering a grieving widow during her husband's funeral reception was staggering. Even for a woman as controlling as Francine, this was an entirely new low. But I was so incredibly tired. The physical and emotional exhaustion was pulling me under like a dark, heavy tide. I felt completely hollow inside. I looked down at the thick stack of documents spilling out of the manila folder. Bold legal print demanded my immediate signature on the dotted line. They had even brought a notary pen. It was a heavy gold fountain pen that Francine now pushed aggressively into my shaking hand. "Just sign the paper, Jillian," Harrison pressed. He stepped much closer and deliberately crowded my personal space to intimidate me. "You are just a florist. You have absolutely no idea how to handle complex real estate liabilities or municipal tax codes. Let the men handle the real business. You just focus on your little flowers and try not to lose your house before the bank comes calling." The kitchen suddenly felt like it was shrinking rapidly. The combined weight of my fresh grief and my physical exhaustion, and their relentless calculated bullying, was successfully breaking my resolve. My mind was spinning with confusion and fear. I did not care about a toxic hunting camp in the middle of nowhere. If it really was a financial black hole that Trevor had secretly poured money into, maybe signing it away was the right thing to do. Maybe they were actually telling the truth for once. I lowered the heavy gold pen toward the crisp white paper. The gold tip hovered just inches above the signature line. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal barrel. I took a shaky breath and prepared to sign away the only thing Trevor had left behind. Just as the wet ink was about to touch the page, a deep, commanding voice cut through the heavy air of the kitchen like a sharp knife. "I would strongly advise against signing that document today." I snapped my head up and gasped. Standing perfectly still in the kitchen doorway was Mr. Caldwell. He was Trevor's personal estate lawyer. He was a notoriously tight-lipped and deeply intimidating man who rarely spoke a word unless he was actively billing a client by the hour. I had only met him a handful of times during our marriage, but his intense presence commanded immediate respect. He wore a sharp, dark gray suit, and his expression was completely unreadable as his eyes locked onto the pen in my hand. Francine turned on him instantly. Her eyes flashed with sudden, furious panic. "This is a private family matter, Caldwell," she snapped loudly, her voice losing its composed, wealthy veneer. "We are handling Trevor's outstanding liabilities. You can leave my daughter-in-law alone and exit this house immediately." Mr. Caldwell ignored her completely. He did not even flinch at her demanding tone. He walked with measured and deliberate steps across the kitchen floor. His leather shoes tapped softly against the tile. He placed his tall frame squarely between me and my aggressive in-laws, blocking their access to the kitchen island. He reached out with a steady hand and smoothly confiscated the gold fountain pen right out of my trembling fingers. He calmly capped the pen and slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then, without ever looking back at Francine or Harrison, he reached deep into his other pocket. He pulled out a heavy and highly advanced electronic key fob. It was sleek and matte black, and completely unlike any traditional key you would ever use for a dilapidated hunting shack in the woods. He slid the heavy device directly into the palm of my hand and gently closed my cold fingers around it. He leaned in close to me. His voice dropped to a harsh and urgent whisper that was meant only for my ears to hear. "Do not sign anything until you drive up there. Your husband was not who you thought he was." The air in the law office was completely stagnant. heavy with the scent of lemon polish and old leather. 3 days had passed since I stood in my own kitchen and felt that mysterious electronic key fob pressed into my palm by the very man sitting at the head of the conference table. I had barely slept a single hour since the funeral. I sat alone on one side of a massive mahogany table, clutching my leather purse tightly to keep my hands from shaking. Directly across from me sat my mother-in-law Francine, my brother-in-law Harrison, and Harrison's deeply condescending wife, Vanessa. They did not look like a family in mourning. They looked like a corporate acquisition team ready to strip a bankrupt company for parts. They had even brought their own aggressive attorney, a slick man in a pinstripe suit who kept tapping an expensive pen against his legal pad with a rhythmic, threatening beat. "Let us skip the pleasantries and the legal jargon," Caldwell Harrison demanded, leaning back in his plush leather chair and crossing his arms. "We all know exactly why we are here today. My brother left a complete financial disaster behind, and we need to clean it up immediately before his mess ruins our family name." Francine adjusted her designer silk scarf and cast a look of profound pity across the table at me. "Trevor died practically penniless, Jillian." She sighed, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You must know that by now. He was constantly bailing out your little plant shop. Keeping your hobby afloat completely drained his personal accounts. We are just trying to handle the fallout of his generosity toward you." I stiffened in my chair, my grief momentarily eclipsed by a sharp spike of anger. "My business is a highly profitable luxury botanical nursery," I stated, keeping my voice as level as possible. "I provide rare, exotic installations for high-end corporate clients across the state. I have never asked Trevor for a single dime to fund my operations. In fact, my income paid for our mortgage for the last 2 years." Vanessa let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet office. "Oh, please, Jillian, do not embarrass yourself. You play in the dirt all day. You are just a glorified dirt digger who arranges pretty leaves in glass bowls. Do not pretend you understand complex real estate liabilities or profit margins. Trevor shielded you from the harsh reality of your own financial failures because he felt sorry for you. He was a successful man who ruined his own credit trying to play the supportive husband to a woman who had absolutely no business sense." Mr. Caldwell did not react to their vicious taunts. He sat perfectly straight, his face a mask of absolute neutrality, and opened a thick leather-bound portfolio on his desk. "If we are quite finished with the personal commentary, I will begin reviewing the outstanding financials of the estate," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice cold and authoritative. He pulled out a stack of dense financial ledgers and began reading the figures aloud. My blood ran completely cold as the numbers filled the room. "According to the current banking records," Mr. Caldwell stated, looking directly at me, "the estate is currently encumbered by a massive $1.5 million line of credit." I gasped, feeling the air rush out of my lungs. "A $1.5 million loan," I repeated, my voice trembling with shock. "Against what asset? Trevor and I do not own anything worth that much money. Our house is heavily mortgaged." Mr. Caldwell slid a copy of a banking document across the smooth mahogany wood toward me. "The loan was taken out against the commercial property deed for your botanical nursery and heavily leveraged against the principal balance of your childhood inheritance trust," he explained calmly. "The funds were completely exhausted over the past 36 months." I stared blindly at the black ink on the white paper. The numbers blurred together as a wave of intense nausea washed over me. I looked at the bottom of the page and saw my own signature scrawled across the authorization line. But I had never seen this document before in my life. The signature was a perfect, meticulous forgery. Trevor had copied my handwriting perfectly, likely tracing it from our original home mortgage paperwork. The man I had shared a bed with for 6 years had secretly, systematically drained everything I had ever worked for and everything my late parents had left behind for my future. He had stolen $1.5 million from me while smiling in my face and eating dinner at my table. Francine waved her manicured hand in the air, entirely unbothered by the revelation of her dead son's massive felony. "A husband often has to make tough, difficult decisions for a clueless wife," Francine declared smoothly. "He was clearly just moving assets around to protect you from your own incompetence, Jillian." He probably needed the capital to cover up the massive losses your little flower shop was generating. He was being a provider. I looked at her in absolute horror. He forged my signature on federal banking documents, I said, my voice rising in disbelief. He committed massive financial fraud and stole my inheritance. Harrison slammed his hand down on the table, making the coffee cups rattle. Do not you dare accuse my brother of a crime when he is not here to defend himself, Harrison shouted, his face turning a mottled red. He was trying to save you from bankruptcy. Now you owe the bank $1.5 million that you obviously cannot pay back. You are going to lose your business and your house by the end of the month. The slick corporate attorney sitting next to Harrison finally stopped tapping his pen and slid a single crisp document across the table toward me. That is exactly why we are here today, to help you, the attorney said with a greasy smile. My clients are willing to assume the entire $1.5 million debt. They will pay off the bank completely and save you from total financial ruin. In exchange, all you have to do is sign this quitclaim deed officially transferring ownership of Trevor's upstate hunting farm over to Harrison. It is a very generous offer considering you brought absolutely nothing of value to this marriage. I looked down at the quitclaim deed. It was the exact same demand they had made in my kitchen while my husband's funeral guests were still eating sandwiches in my living room. The aggressive desperation in their voices was palpable. They were trying to bully me into signing away a piece of property I had never even been allowed to see. Trevor had spent our entire marriage describing the upstate farm as a toxic, hazardous wasteland full of black mold and sinking foundations. He claimed it was a worthless money pit. Why would you possibly want to assume a massive $1.5 million debt just to take ownership of a rotting hunting cabin built on toxic soil? I asked, narrowing my eyes at Harrison. Because it has sentimental family value. Harrison snapped too quickly, avoiding my direct gaze. It was Trevor's place. We want to keep it in the family to honor his memory. You have absolutely no use for a rugged hunting camp anyway. Just sign the paper, Jillian, and we will make your massive debt problem disappear today. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were completely contradicting each other. Trevor had stolen millions from me but claimed he was broke. He bought a toxic wasteland but strictly forbade me from ever driving up to see it. Now his greedy, arrogant family was desperate to take ownership of this supposedly worthless piece of dirt and willing to absorb a massive fortune in debt just to get my name off the deed. I reached into my purse. My fingers brushed against the heavy, high-tech electronic key fob that Mr. Caldwell had slipped into my hand 3 days earlier. I remembered his urgent whispered warning not to sign anything until I saw the property for myself. I looked up and met Mr. Caldwell's eyes across the table. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, just a fraction of a movement that confirmed my growing suspicions. I slowly zipped my purse closed and stood up from the mahogany table. I will not be signing anything today, I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. Francine shot out of her chair, her perfectly styled facade shattering into pure venomous rage. Her face contorted into an ugly, vicious sneer. Do not play games with me, you ungrateful little girl, Francine snarled, pointing a sharp finger directly at my face. You are drowning in debt, and you are entirely out of your depth. If you do not sign that property over to Harrison by Friday afternoon, I will personally ruin you. I will call every elite corporate supplier and every luxury event venue in this city. I will use every social connection I possess to ensure your business is permanently blacklisted. You will never sell another flower in this state. You will be completely bankrupt and out on the street by next week. I looked at the woman who had pretended to be my family for 6 years. I saw the absolute ruthless cruelty in her eyes and realized she meant every single word. She would gladly destroy my entire life just to get her hands on that deed. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply looked at her and said, "We will see about that." I turned my back on them and walked out of the law office, ignoring Harrison shouting my name down the quiet hallway. I took the elevator down to the parking garage, feeling a strange cold calm wash over my entire body. The devastating grief that had paralyzed me for days was suddenly gone, completely burned away by the white-hot reality of their betrayal. I got into my car and locked the doors. I pulled out my phone and opened the mapping application. I did not type in the address for my botanical nursery. I did not type in the address for my empty, heavily mortgaged home. Instead, I pulled up the tax documents Mr. Caldwell had provided and typed the exact rural coordinates for Trevor's forbidden upstate property into my GPS. The digital voice of the navigation system instructed me to merge onto the highway for a 3-hour drive north. I put the car in drive and gripped the steering wheel tightly. I was going to find out exactly what my husband had stolen $1.5 million to build and why my deeply arrogant in-laws were so incredibly desperate to take it from me. The tires of my car squealed against the slick concrete of the parking garage as I drove toward the exit. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I merged onto the busy interstate and pointed my car north, leaving the towering glass buildings of the city behind me. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2 in the afternoon. I had a 3-hour drive ahead of me to reach the rural coordinates programmed into my navigation system. For the first hour, I drove in complete silence. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rush of wind against the windows. The shock of the lawyer's office was slowly wearing off, leaving behind a cold and sharp clarity. Trevor had stolen $1.5 million from me. He had forged my signature. He had leveraged my childhood inheritance and the botanical nursery I built from scratch. He had done all of this while looking me straight in the eye and lying about our finances every single day of our marriage. As the city landscape gave way to the sprawling green suburbs, my mind began to replay every conversation we ever had about the upstate property. Trevor had bought the land 4 years ago. He told me it was a cheap tax foreclosure, a piece of unwanted dirt with a rotting cabin that nobody else wanted. I remembered standing in our kitchen early one Friday morning, packing him a lunch for his weekend trip. I had asked him simply and warmly if I could finally come with him. I told him I wanted to see where my husband spent half of his life. I told him I did not mind roughing it for a weekend. Trevor had slammed his coffee mug down on the counter so hard that hot liquid spilled over the edges. He turned to me with eyes full of cold annoyance. He told me to drop the subject immediately. He said the property was a hazardous dump and that I would absolutely hate it. He claimed the area was swarming with aggressive wildlife and lacked basic plumbing. When I gently pushed back and said I just wanted to be with him, his annoyance quickly turned into vicious anger. He accused me of suffocating him. He said he worked grueling hours to support my pathetic little plant hobby, and he deserved one single place on earth that was just his. He told me I was being selfish and demanding. I had backed down immediately and apologized for nagging him. I spent that entire weekend feeling incredibly guilty while he was allegedly freezing in a broken cabin. The highway narrowed into a 2-lane state road as I drove deeper into the northern counties. Thick forests of pine and oak began to line the shoulders of the road. The memory of his manipulation made me press my foot harder on the gas pedal. I remembered another fight we had about the property just last year. I had noticed large withdrawals from our joint checking account. When I asked him about the missing money, he played the part of the stressed and burdened provider. He claimed he was forced to buy expensive industrial equipment to deal with a massive toxic hazard on the farm. He painted a terrifying picture of the property to ensure I would never dare to visit. He told me the foundation of the old hunting shack was sinking into highly unstable mud. He swore the walls were completely infested with dangerous toxic black mold. He reminded me that I had mild asthma and said the air quality in the cabin would put me in the hospital. He looked at me with deep concern and said he was only keeping me away to protect my health. He played the martyr perfectly. He claimed he went up there every weekend to do brutal back-breaking labor just to clear his head from the extreme stress of carrying our family financially. I believed every single word. I used the profits from my botanical nursery to replace the money he took from our joint account. I worked late into the night designing custom floral installations just to make his life easier. The sheer irony of his lies made me sick to my stomach. He was draining my business to fund his secret life while telling me my business was a worthless drain on his resources. The navigation system instructed me to take an upcoming exit. The scenery was completely rural now. I drove past sprawling dairy farms and old rusty tractors parked in fields of tall grass. The sky above was a bright, clear blue, but a dark storm of realization was brewing inside my mind. I thought about the final time I had tried to talk to him about the farm. It was only 2 months ago. My nursery had just secured a massive ongoing contract with a luxury hotel chain. I had received a huge advance payment. I sat down with Trevor and excitedly offered to use that money to fix his sanctuary. I told him we could hire professional contractors to safely remove the black mold and stabilize the sinking foundation. I wanted to give him a safe place to relax. His reaction was explosive and terrifying. He stood up from the dinner table and pointed a finger directly at my face. He told me to leave it alone. He commanded me to stop nagging him about his private retreat. He shouted that I cared more about fixing a rotting cabin than I cared about his actual mental health. He said my constant pestering was driving him away. He made me feel like a horrible, unsupportive wife for offering to help him. He gaslit me into believing that my kindness was actually a form of toxic control. I had cried myself to sleep that night completely unaware that my husband was actively stealing millions of dollars from me to fund whatever was hiding at the end of this road. Turn right onto County Road 9, the digital voice of the GPS announced, breaking through my dark thoughts. I flicked my turn signal and steered the car onto a smaller road. I expected the asphalt to turn into broken gravel or packed dirt. Trevor had always complained about the brutal off-road driving required to reach his cabin. He claimed he constantly needed new tires because the path was so rugged and unmaintained. I braced myself for a rough and bumpy ride. Instead, my tires glided smoothly onto a pristine and flawlessly paved blacktop road. The surface was incredibly fresh and dark, without a single pothole or crack in sight. The wild, unkempt trees that bordered the county road suddenly gave way to perfectly manicured landscaping. Tall, elegant oak trees were planted at exact intervals, lining the sides of the street like soldiers on parade. The grass on the shoulders was mowed to absolute perfection. This was not an abandoned logging trail. This was the entrance to an elite private estate. My heart hammered against my ribs as I drove slowly down the flawless road. I covered exactly 1 mile before the road widened into a grand circular turnaround. I pressed the brakes and brought the car to a complete stop. I stared through the windshield in absolute disbelief. I had fully expected to find a rusty chain-link fence held together by padlocks and warning signs. I expected to see danger signs warning trespassers of toxic waste and unstable structures. What stood before me was a towering state-of-the-art wrought iron security gate. The massive black iron doors were set between two enormous pillars made of hand-carved river stone. Elegant copper lanterns sat atop the pillars, glowing warmly in the afternoon light. High-definition security cameras were mounted discreetly on the stone, tracking my car with smooth robotic precision. A sleek digital keypad stood on a metal pedestal waiting for an access code. The entire setup screamed of extreme wealth and high-level security. My hands shook violently as I put the car in park. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out the heavy matte black key fob that Mr. Caldwell had given me. The device felt cold and heavy in my palm. It had 3 simple buttons. I stared at the gate and then down at the fob. My breath hitched in my throat. Trevor had told me he slept on a cot in a moldy room. He told me he used a bucket for water. He told me he was broke. I aimed the electronic fob directly at the digital keypad and pressed the top button. A soft electronic chime echoed through the quiet air. A small green light flashed on the stone pillar. Without a single sound, the massive wrought iron gates began to swing open. There was no screeching of rusty hinges. There was no grinding of old metal. The heavy gates glided inward with the silent grace of expensive top-tier engineering. The path ahead was completely clear. I shifted the car back into drive and pressed the gas pedal. I rolled slowly past the stone pillars and onto the private grounds. The paved road began to wind its way up a very steep and incredibly long hill. The landscaping on either side of the road was breathtaking. Meticulous garden beds filled with rare imported flowers and perfectly trimmed hedges lined the drive. I recognized several highly expensive botanical varieties that cost thousands of dollars to import and maintain. My husband, who claimed my floral business was a pathetic joke, had spent a fortune on professional landscaping. I followed the curving road as it climbed higher and higher toward the sky. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my joints ached. I could not see what was at the top of the hill, but the sheer scale of the grounds was staggering. I drove for another 2 minutes, climbing the steep incline until the trees finally parted. I reached the crest of the hill and the landscape suddenly opened up. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal with all my strength. The car jerked to a violent halt, throwing me forward against my seatbelt. I threw the gear shift into park and stared out the windshield. The breath completely left my lungs. My mouth fell open in total silent shock. There was no rotting hunting cabin. There was no sinking foundation, and there was absolutely no toxic wasteland. Stretching out before me in every direction was a breathtaking 50-acre luxury vineyard. Endless rows of vibrant, healthy grapevines rolled across the sunlit hills, perfectly aligned and meticulously cared for. The green leaves shimmered in the afternoon light, but the vines were only the beginning. Sitting proudly in the very center of the vast estate was a massive multi-million-dollar modern rustic event lodge. It was a masterpiece of luxury architecture. The building was constructed from massive imported timber beams and elegant natural stone. A towering wall of pristine glass stretched across the entire front of the lodge, offering panoramic views of the entire valley. A sprawling wraparound deck made of rich, polished hardwood encircled the massive structure. Expensive outdoor lounge furniture surrounded massive stone fire pits on the patio. A private paved parking lot sat off to the side, large enough to accommodate 100 guests. I sat in my idling car, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the deception. Trevor did not buy a hunting camp. Trevor had used the $1.5 million he stole from my business and my inheritance to build a breathtaking luxury empire in secret. He had drained my life dry to create this masterpiece. And now his greedy family was waiting back in the city, desperate for me to sign it all away. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle, ready to step inside the lie my husband had built. I pushed open the heavy car door and stepped onto the immaculate crushed stone driveway. The crisp, upstate air lacked any trace of the toxic rot Trevor had warned me about for years. Instead, it smelled of fresh pine and expensive cedar wood. My legs felt like lead as I walked up the wide flagstone steps leading to the main entrance of the lodge. The front doors were massive slabs of custom-milled timber bound by iron hardware. A sleek electronic lock pulsed with a faint blue light beside the heavy handles. My hand shook as I raised the black key fob Mr. Caldwell had given me. I pressed it against the scanner. A soft mechanical click echoed through the quiet afternoon, and the heavy door unlatched. I pushed it open and stepped over the threshold into an entirely different world. I completely lost my breath. The interior of the lodge was an absolute masterpiece of luxury architecture. Vaulted ceilings soared 3 stories high, supported by massive exposed wooden beams that smelled of rich oil and wealth. Sunlight poured through a wall of panoramic windows, bathing the sprawling room in a warm, golden glow. Enormous crystal chandeliers hung from the rafters, catching the light and throwing fractured rainbows across the imported Brazilian hardwood floors. A massive double-sided stone fireplace dominated the center of the grand hall. Every single detail screamed of limitless budgets and elite designers. There was no sinking foundation and no black mold. This was a high-end playground for the ultra-rich. But the most shocking part of the grand hall was not the million-dollar architecture. It was the sound of uproarious laughter echoing from the far side of the room. I followed the sound, my footsteps muffled by a thick hand-woven artisan rug. In a sunken lounge area overlooking the vineyard, I found them. Francine Harrison and his wife Vanessa were lounging on a set of curved white leather sofas. A silver ice bucket sat on a low glass table between them, chilling a bottle of vintage champagne. Spread out across the table were dozens of expensive fabric swatches, floral arrangement catalogs, and glossy catering brochures. They were completely relaxed, celebrating in the very place my husband had supposedly hidden away to suffer in squalor. Vanessa was the first one to spot me. She paused with a crystal flute of champagne halfway to her lips. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in mild surprise before settling into her trademark sneer. "Look what the cat dragged in," Vanessa drawled, setting her glass down with a delicate clink. "Try not to track mud onto the imported rugs, Jillian. These cost more than your entire greenhouse inventory." Francine and Harrison turned their heads lazily. I fully expected them to panic. I expected them to scramble to hide the evidence of their massive deception or feign some sort of innocent ignorance. They did absolutely none of that. Instead, Harrison leaned back into the plush leather cushions, laced his fingers behind his head, and smiled with pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Well, I suppose it was only a matter of time before you figured out how to use a GPS." Harrison mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Though I am honestly surprised Caldwell gave you the keys. I told Trevor we should have fired that stiff-necked lawyer months ago." I stood frozen at the edge of the sunken lounge. My heart hammered furiously against my ribs. "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound rage and sickening betrayal. "Trevor told me this was a toxic hunting camp. He said the foundation was collapsing. He told me he slept on a cot in a moldy room." Francine let out a sharp, elegant laugh that cut through the room like shattered glass. "Oh, Jillian, you really are painfully naive," Francine said, picking up a velvet fabric swatch and examining it in the sunlight. "Did you truly believe my son would spend his weekends sleeping in a toxic shack in the woods? Trevor was a man of refined tastes. He just needed a convincing story to keep you and your constant whining far away from our real family business." Harrison stood up and walked over to the champagne bucket. He poured himself a fresh glass with slow, deliberate movements, deliberately showcasing his total lack of fear. "I will lay it out for you simply so your simple florist brain can understand," Harrison said, taking a sip of his drink. "I had a few unfortunate setbacks with my commercial real estate ventures in the city. The market was highly unpredictable, and I lost a bit of investor capital." "A bit of capital," I shot back, my voice rising in anger. "You bankrupted 3 separate companies in 5 years, Harrison. You lost millions." Francine slammed her hand down on the glass table. "Do not speak to your brother-in-law that way." Francine snapped, her eyes flashing with maternal fury. "Harrison is a visionary. He just needed the right project to showcase his talents. That is why I went to Trevor. I told him he needed to step up and secure his older brother's future. Trevor agreed that family always comes first. So he bought this pristine 50-acre property to build a luxury wedding and wellness retreat for Harrison to run." The sickening truth crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. The $1.5 million Trevor had stolen from my business and my childhood inheritance was not lost to a bad investment or a gambling debt. He had deliberately siphoned every single dime I had ever earned to build a luxury empire for his incompetent golden child brother. He had forged my signature on federal bank loans to buy crystal chandeliers and imported hardwood floors for Harrison. He stole my inheritance to build you a wedding venue. I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. He ruined my business and saddled me with massive debt just to bail you out again. Trevor did what was necessary to protect the true legacy of this family, Harrison replied, entirely unbothered by my devastation. Your little plant shop was never going to generate real generational wealth, Jillian. You were just playing in the dirt. Trevor put that dead equity to good use. This luxury retreat will generate millions in revenue every single season. Then I will sell it, I declared, taking a defiant step forward into the sunken lounge. If my stolen money built this place, then I own it. I will sell this entire vineyard tomorrow and pay off the fraudulent loans Trevor took out in my name. You will not get a single dime." The 3 of them stared at me for a long, silent moment. Then they burst into cruel, uproarious laughter. Vanessa laughed so hard she had to wipe away a fake tear from the corner of her eye. "You really do not understand how the real world works, do you, Jillian?" Vanessa mocked, shaking her head in pity. You cannot sell a single blade of grass on this property. Harrison set his champagne flute down and stepped up to me, invading my personal space just as he had done in my kitchen 3 days earlier. Trevor was not a fool. Jillian Harrison sneered, looking down his nose at me. He knew exactly how volatile you could be. He deliberately placed this entire estate, the land, the lodge, the vineyard, into an anonymous shell corporation. The corporate entity holds the deed, not Trevor. And it certainly does not belong to his clueless widow. You have absolutely zero legal rights to this property. You cannot sell it. You cannot claim it. You do not even have the legal authority to stand in this room. The walls of the Grand Lodge suddenly felt like they were spinning. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. They had planned this flawlessly. Trevor had trapped me in a mountain of forged debt and completely insulated the physical asset so I could never touch it. I was going to lose my business, my childhood home, and my entire future while Harrison popped expensive champagne in a luxury resort paid for with my money. You have exactly 10 minutes to leave my property, Harrison commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening growl. If your car is not outside the front gates by the time I finish this glass of champagne, I am going to call the local police. I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing and breaking and entering. Now get out of my house. I looked at Francine, hoping to find even a shred of human decency in the woman who had called me her daughter for 6 years. She simply turned her back to me and picked up another glossy catering brochure, completely dismissing my existence. I had lost. They had successfully orchestrated the perfect financial execution and left me holding the bag. A crushing wave of absolute defeat settled heavily over my shoulders. I felt the tears of sheer frustration burning the backs of my eyes, but I refused to let them see me cry. I turned around and began the long, humiliating walk across the imported hardwood floors toward the massive front doors. Every step felt like I was wading through thick, heavy mud. My mind raced, frantically searching for any possible way out of this nightmare, but the legal reality was a brick wall. If the property was locked inside an anonymous shell corporation, I was completely powerless. I reached the grand entryway and pushed open the heavy timber door, the afternoon sunlight suddenly feeling harsh and unforgiving. I stepped out onto the flagstone porch and let the heavy door click shut behind me, sealing my arrogant in-laws inside their stolen palace. I kept my head down and started walking toward my car, preparing for the long, agonizing drive back to a city where I owed $1.5 million to a ruthless bank. But as I reached the bottom of the stone steps, a sudden movement caught the corner of my eye. Someone was standing perfectly still in the deep, cool shadows of the wraparound hallway that ran along the exterior of the lodge. I stopped breathing. A tall figure stepped out of the darkness and into the fading afternoon light, blocking my path to the parking lot. The man stepped completely out of the long shadows cast by the overhanging roof and moved directly into the path of the afternoon sun. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing faded denim work jeans and scuffed heavy leather boots that were coated in a fine layer of pale vineyard dust. A dark canvas jacket was zipped tightly over a gray thermal shirt. His face was weathered and lined from years of grueling outdoor labor, and his dark eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely focused on me. I froze instantly on the flagstone path. My hand gripped the strap of my leather purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. My first instinct was blind panic. I assumed Harrison had already made good on his vicious threat and summoned the estate's private security detail to have me forcefully removed from the premises. I braced my entire body for another deeply humiliating confrontation. "Ma'am," the man said. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying a rough edge that perfectly matched his rugged appearance. "I am going to need to see some official identification before you go anywhere." I stared at him while my heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. "Harrison sent you, did not he?" I asked. My voice was shaking with a heavy mixture of lingering fear and fresh defensive rage. "You can tell my arrogant brother-in-law to save his breath. I am already walking to my car. I am leaving this property right now. You do not need to physically escort me out of the parking lot." The man did not step aside. He remained planted firmly between me and my vehicle. He crossed his thick, muscular arms over his broad chest and stared down at me with an expression that was surprisingly completely devoid of malice. "Mr. Harrison does not give me orders," the man replied flatly. His tone held a thick, heavy layer of absolute contempt when he spoke Harrison's name. In fact, Mr. Harrison does not have the legal or professional authority to order a single person around on this entire property. Now please hand over your driver's license. I need to verify exactly who you are. I hesitated for a long, tense moment. I looked back over my shoulder toward the massive glass windows of the Grand Lodge, half expecting to see Francine and Vanessa standing there gloating at my exit. The windows reflected only the bright blue sky and the rolling green hills of the vineyard. I reached into my purse with trembling fingers and pulled out my wallet. I slid my state-issued driver's license out of the plastic sleeve and handed it over to the rugged stranger. He took the small plastic card and studied it carefully. His dark eyes darted back and forth between my printed photograph and my exhausted, tear-stained face. He read my full legal name. He read my home address. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. He handed the card back to me and looked up past my shoulder toward the towering luxury lodge. His jaw clenched tight, and a look of profound, absolute disgust washed over his weathered features. "My name is Jackson," he said, extending a large, calloused hand toward me. "I am the chief operations manager for this entire estate. I oversee the vineyard, the event staff, and the groundskeeping crew. I have been watching those three vultures sitting in the lounge drinking expensive champagne all afternoon. They think they own this place because Trevor promised it to them." I shook his hand tentatively. His grip was firm and grounding. "He promised it to them." I repeated, my voice cracking slightly. "Trevor built this entire luxury empire with money he stole from my business. He forged my signature on federal bank loans to buy this land and construct that building. Now Harrison says the property is locked inside an anonymous shell corporation and I have absolutely no legal rights to it. He gave me 10 minutes to leave before he calls the police to arrest me for trespassing." Jackson let out a harsh, humorless laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Harrison is an arrogant fool who has never worked a hard day in his entire miserable life," Jackson stated bluntly. "He has been strutting around this property for the last 3 days, acting like he is the supreme king of the valley. He has been barking orders at my agricultural staff and demanding immediate changes to the event menus without knowing the first thing about soil pH levels or hospitality logistics. He is a walking disaster who is going to run this beautiful vineyard straight into the ground by the end of the harvest season." I looked down at the paved driveway, feeling the crushing weight of reality pressing heavily against my shoulders. "It does not matter how incompetent Harrison is," I whispered, feeling a fresh wave of defeat wash over me. "If the deed is protected by a corporate shield, I cannot touch it. My lawyer told me not to sign the quitclaim deed until I came up here to see the truth. Well, I have seen the truth, Jackson. My husband was a monster who robbed me blind to fund his brother's failures. And now I am going to lose my botanical nursery and my childhood home to pay off the bank." Jackson stepped closer to me and lowered his voice. His sharp eyes scanned the perimeter of the parking lot, checking for any listening ears. "You need to come with me right now," Jackson instructed urgently. "Where?" I asked, taking a cautious step back. "I told you I have to leave before they call the cops." "They are not going to call the cops on you," Jackson assured me, his voice steady and remarkably calm. "And you are not leaving this property until I show you exactly how this entire operation is structured." Trevor was a brilliant liar, but he was also incredibly paranoid. He did not trust his mother, and he certainly did not trust his idiot brother. "Follow me." Jackson turned on his heavy leather boots and began walking briskly away from the parking lot. He did not head toward the grand front doors of the luxury lodge. Instead, he led me down a narrow gravel path that curved tightly around the side of the massive stone building. The path was hidden from the main driveway by a thick, towering wall of perfectly manicured evergreen hedges. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before my desperate need for answers propelled my feet forward. I hurried down the gravel path to keep pace with his long, sweeping strides. We walked in silence for several minutes, wrapping completely around the back of the enormous event center. The rear of the property featured a sprawling stone patio that overlooked the rolling rows of grapevines dipping down into the lush green valley. Jackson bypassed the patio entirely and led me toward a small, unassuming standalone building tucked neatly into the shadow of the main lodge. It was constructed of the same dark timber and natural stone, but it lacked any decorative windows or welcoming glass doors. Thick climbing ivy covered most of the exterior walls, intentionally camouflaging the structure from the rest of the estate. "What is this place?" I asked, my breathing slightly elevated from the rapid walk. "This is the central nervous system of the entire estate," Jackson explained, stopping in front of a heavy reinforced steel door that was painted a dark matte brown. "This is the secure management office. It houses the primary computer servers, the physical security feeds, and the master corporate files." Jackson reached out and lifted a small sliding metal panel on the wall next to the heavy door. Underneath the panel was a sleek, glowing digital keypad and a biometric fingerprint scanner. He punched in a long, complex numerical code and then pressed his right thumb firmly against the glowing green glass of the scanner. A loud mechanical clank echoed from inside the thick steel door as the heavy internal deadbolts retracted. Trevor was utterly obsessed with absolute control. Jackson continued pushing his shoulder against the steel door to swing it open. He hired me to build this place from the dirt up because he knew I ran the best agricultural crew in the state. But he treated my team like absolute garbage. He was condescending and cruel. He constantly bragged on the phone about his brilliant financing strategies and how he was pulling cash out of thin air. I knew he was siphoning money from somewhere illicit, but he kept the details locked down tight. We stepped into the office and Jackson hit a light switch. The room was surprisingly cold, heavily air-conditioned to protect the towering racks of black computer servers humming loudly in the corner. The walls were lined with large metal filing cabinets. A massive wraparound desk dominated the center of the room, supporting 3 large high-definition computer monitors. "Francine and Harrison do not have the access codes to this room," Jackson stated, walking around the desk and tapping the keyboard to wake the glowing monitors. Trevor explicitly programmed the security system to lock his own family out of the management servers. He wanted them to have the illusion of power, while he maintained total absolute dominance over the actual assets. I stood in the center of the chilly room, wrapping my arms around myself. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, staring at his broad back as he typed rapidly on the keyboard. "If Trevor hired you, why are you showing me this?" "Because I despise bullies," Jackson answered without looking away from the glowing screens. "I hated Trevor's arrogant guts, and I despise Harrison's pathetic incompetence. I have poured my blood and sweat into this soil for 4 years to make this vineyard thrive. I am not going to watch a spoiled, entitled brat destroy my life's work just because his mommy handed him the keys. I have been waiting for the real owner of this money to finally show up." Jackson clicked his computer mouse several times, opening a series of encrypted digital folders. He navigated through a maze of complex legal documents and dense financial ledgers. The bright light from the monitors reflected off his serious, weathered face. "Harrison was telling you the truth about one thing," Jackson said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Trevor did place this entire 50-acre estate, the luxury lodge, the vineyards, and the corporate bank accounts, into an anonymous shell corporation. It is a highly complex limited liability company, designed to completely mask the identity of the true owner and shield the assets from standard audits." I felt a heavy sinking sensation in my chest. Then Harrison was right. I whispered, my voice barely audible over the loud humming of the cooling fans. "I cannot touch it. I cannot sell it. I am trapped with a $1.5 million debt." Jackson stopped typing. He took a slow, deep breath and turned the center computer monitor around so it directly faced me. The screen displayed a highly official corporate registration document stamped by the state government. "Mr. Trevor made a fatal mistake with the LLC paperwork," Ma'am Jackson says, pulling up the master deeds and corporate filings. "Let me show you the real books. You are not a trespasser here. You are the landlord." I leaned closer to the glowing computer monitor, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon filling the bright screen. Jackson pointed a calloused, thick finger at the top of the digital document. There, typed in bold black letters, was my full legal name, followed by my exact social security number. I blinked rapidly, trying to force the words into a logical sequence that made sense. I asked Jackson what I was looking at, and why my personal information was listed on the master deed of a property I had never seen before today. Jackson pulled up a secondary screen showing the state registration files and a series of complex tax documents. Trevor was a lot of things, but he was mostly a greedy coward, Jackson stated, keeping his voice low and steady. He siphoned $1.5 million out of your business and your trust fund to acquire this land and begin the initial construction. If he had registered this massive 50-acre property and the newly formed corporate entity under his own name, it would have triggered massive capital gains taxes. It also would have thrown a giant red flag to the federal auditors who monitor high-net-worth individuals. He needed a pristine financial background to shield the stolen assets, so he used yours. I stared at the screen as the horrifying brilliance of my dead husband's scheme washed over me. Trevor had stolen my money to buy the land, and then he registered the land under my identity to hide his theft from the government. He had essentially used me as an unwitting money launderer. He made you the sole managing member of the limited liability company, Jackson explained, tapping the glass of the monitor. He did not list himself as a partner or a co-owner. He completely removed his name from the deed to avoid triggering an audit by the Internal Revenue Service. He maintained total control by simply hiding behind your pristine credit rating and your clean business record. He forged your signature on the operating agreement just like he forged it on the federal bank loans. But that means my voice trailed off as the realization hit me with the physical force of a freight train. That means you own it, Jackson said, turning his chair to face me directly. Legally speaking, Trevor owned absolutely nothing. His family owns absolutely nothing. You are the sole managing member of a luxury estate currently appraised at $15 million. You own the Grand Lodge. You own the 50 acres of imported vineyards. You own the custom furniture, the crystal chandeliers, and the very ground Harrison is standing on right now. The heavy chill of the server room suddenly vanished entirely, replaced by a hot, surging rush of adrenaline. The crushing weight of the $1.5 million debt that had been suffocating me for days instantly evaporated from my shoulders. I did not owe a massive debt on a worthless piece of toxic swampland. I was the sole legal owner of a $15 million empire. Francine and Harrison were sitting in my sunken lounge drinking my vintage champagne and threatening me with police action for standing on my own property. They do not know. I whispered, my eyes wide as I looked at Jackson. Harrison said the property was in an anonymous shell corporation. He thinks Trevor set it up to protect the assets from me. Jackson let out a low rumble of a laugh that sounded like heavy stones grinding together. Harrison is too lazy to do a basic title search, and Francine is too arrogant to believe a florist could outsmart her. They saw a corporate entity name on the front gate and assumed Trevor left it for them. Your husband told his mother and brother that this place was his secret legacy project. He promised Francine he would hand the keys over to Harrison when the construction was completely finished. Jackson crossed his thick arms over his chest and looked at me with deep, solemn sympathy. Trevor was planning to divorce you, Jillian. He was going to blindside you with the massive fraudulent debt, leave you bankrupt, and transfer the corporate ownership to his brother before you ever knew what hit you. But the aneurysm got him first. He died before he could sign the transfer papers. I placed my hands flat on the cool, smooth surface of the wrap-around desk. My husband had planned to destroy my entire life and leave me homeless while he and his arrogant family built generational wealth using my stolen money. The betrayal was so absolute and so profound that it transcended grief entirely. There was no sadness left in my body. There was only a cold, razor-sharp focus. The woman who had cried in the kitchen 3 days ago was dead. I am going to sell it, I declared, looking at the staggering appraisal value on the screen. I am going to sell this entire estate tomorrow. I will pay off the fraudulent bank loans Trevor took out in my name, and I will leave Francine and Harrison with absolutely nothing. Jackson shook his head slowly. He reached for the computer mouse and opened a new encrypted folder labeled Event Logistics. You might want to wait before you put up a for sale sign at the front gate. Selling the property fixes your debt, but it does not put Harrison behind bars. And trust me, ma'am, Harrison deeply deserves to be behind bars. Jackson brought up a complex master spreadsheet filled with dates, names, and massive financial figures. This is the booking software for the upcoming wedding season, Jackson explained, his gravelly voice dropping to a serious register. This venue is highly exclusive. We only host elite high net worth clients, politicians, celebrities, and corporate executives. The property officially opens for events next month. Over the past 3 weeks since Trevor died, Harrison assumed he was the untouchable legal owner. He has been taking calls from frantic brides and aggressive luxury event planners. Jackson clicked on a specific cell in the spreadsheet, highlighting a long column of routing numbers and bank transfer receipts. Harrison has been aggressively pre-selling luxury wedding packages for the entire upcoming year. He demands the deposits be paid in full, entirely in cash, or direct wire transfer. He tells the wealthy clients it is a strict requirement to secure their date at such a prestigious new venue. I looked at the total sum calculating at the bottom of the spreadsheet. My stomach dropped completely. The number was absolutely staggering. He has collected $2.4 million in cash deposits over the last 21 days. Jackson stated, his voice hard with absolute disgust. But he is not putting that money into the estate's operating account. I monitor the commercial banking lines to pay the landscaping crews and the maintenance staff. The operating account is completely empty. Harrison has been quietly funneling every single dime of those luxury deposits into his own private offshore accounts. He is hiding the money in the Cayman Islands. I stared at the offshore routing numbers glowing brightly on the screen. He is stealing the deposits, I said, my mind racing to comprehend the sheer scale of his reckless greed. He is committing massive federal wire fraud, Jackson corrected sharply. He is using a corporate entity he does not legally own to solicit millions of dollars across state lines. And here is the real kicker. Because he stole the deposit money, the estate is completely unfunded. We have no working capital to hire catering staff, security teams, or floral designers. We cannot purchase food or alcohol. There is no money to actually host a single one of these luxury weddings. When the first bride shows up next month expecting $1 million event, the front gates will be locked. Harrison is planning to take the offshore cash and flee the country before the first major lawsuit hits the courts. I gripped the edge of the desk so hard my fingers ached. He was going to frame me. I realized the horrifying truth settling over me like a suffocating blanket. If my name is on the LLC, then I am the one legally responsible for the venue and the broken contracts. When the angry clients sue for breach of contract and the federal authorities investigate the missing $2.4 million, they would find my name as the sole managing member. Harrison was going to steal the cash and let me take the fall for federal fraud. Jackson nodded grimly. His dark eyes locked on mine. He thinks you are just a clueless florist who will panic and sign a quitclaim deed tomorrow afternoon. He wants you to officially hand over the legal liability before the whole operation completely implodes. He wants to wipe his hands clean and leave you holding the bag for his felony. But he does not realize I kept the real books hidden in the secure server room. I have every single IP address, every wire transfer, and every digital footprint linking the theft directly to Harrison's personal devices. My purse vibrated violently against my hip, breaking the tense, heavy silence in the server room. I reached inside and pulled out my phone. The screen was lit up with a new text message. The sender was Francine. I opened the message and read the cold, demanding words glowing on my screen. I have already called my elite corporate contacts and frozen your nursery's wholesale vendor accounts. Francine wrote her text dripping with venom. Your suppliers will no longer sell you a single flower. Your little business is effectively dead. You will sign the quitclaim deed tomorrow at noon at my lawyer's office, or I will personally ensure the bank has you evicted from your home by Monday morning. Do not test me, Jillian. I stared at the threatening text message. 10 minutes ago, those cruel words would have sent me into a total, absolute panic. 10 minutes ago, I was a terrified, grieving widow drowning in fraudulent debt and facing total bankruptcy. But standing in the heavily air-conditioned server room, looking at the ironclad digital evidence of Harrison's federal wire fraud, everything shifted into crystalline focus. I was not a helpless victim. I was a multi-millionaire landlord holding the key to my arrogant in-laws' total destruction. Francine thought she could starve me out by freezing my flower suppliers. She had no idea she was threatening a woman who owned a $15 million estate. I looked up at Jackson. He was watching me closely, waiting to see if I would run away in fear or if I would finally fight back. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that I had never felt on my own face before. The time for crying was over. I looked back down at my phone and typed a simple two-sentence reply to the woman who thought she held my entire life in her manicured hands. I will be there. You win. I hit send on the text message and watched the little green bubble confirm delivery to Francine. I will be there. You win. It was the most difficult lie I had ever typed, but it was the necessary bait to keep the trap firmly set. I stood in the heavily air-conditioned server room of the upstate estate, looking across the desk at Jackson. The rugged operations manager gave me a single firm nod of approval. He reached over to the glowing computer monitors and began rapidly transferring the mountain of digital evidence onto a sleek encrypted flash drive. He meticulously copied the master property deeds, the state limited liability company filings, and the exhaustive ledgers detailing every single fraudulent offshore wire transfer Harrison had executed over the past 3 weeks. Jackson pulled the silver drive from the server and dropped it directly into my palm. It felt heavier than it actually was, carrying the weight of my entire future and my ultimate vindication. I thanked him for his loyalty and promised him that his job and the livelihoods of his entire agricultural crew were completely safe. I walked out of the hidden management office, slipped past the towering evergreen hedges, and got back into my car. I did not look back at the massive luxury lodge or the sunken lounge where my arrogant in-laws were still sipping expensive champagne. I pointed my car south toward the city and pressed my foot hard on the gas pedal. The 3-hour drive back to civilization felt entirely different than the panicked, grief-stricken journey up. The paralyzing confusion that had clouded my mind for days was gone, completely burned away by a cold, calculating rage. But as the rural landscape shifted back into the sprawling concrete network of the city suburbs, my phone began to ring incessantly. The Bluetooth display on my dashboard lit up with the names of my most trusted botanical suppliers. I answered the first call from Marcus, the owner of the largest exotic orchid importer on the East Coast, and a man I had done steady business with for nearly a decade. His voice was tense and apologetic, but deeply firm. He told me he was incredibly sorry for my sudden loss, but he needed to immediately halt all my pending floral shipments. Francine had apparently spent her entire afternoon making calls to every major vendor in the luxury event circuit. She had weaponized her high society connections to spread a vicious, convincing rumor that Trevor had died drowning in secret debt and that my botanical nursery was completely insolvent. Marcus told me Francine had personally warned him that I would be filing for bankruptcy by Monday morning and that any uncollected invoices would be permanently lost in the courts. Within 30 minutes of hanging up with Marcus, I received 4 more calls exactly like it. The custom glass manufacturers, the rare soil importers, and the wholesale greenhouse distributors all demanded immediate payment in full before they would load another delivery truck. Francine was systematically suffocating the business I had spent 10 years building with my own 2 hands. She was using her immense wealth and her established social status to choke off my supply lines, hoping to incite a total panic. She wanted me to feel utterly destitute, so I would blindly sign away my $15 million estate for absolute pennies just to survive the week. She thought she was tightening a noose around my neck. She had absolutely no idea she was just handing me the rope I would use to hang her son. I did not drive to my nursery to assess the damage, and I certainly did not go back to my empty, heavily mortgaged house. Instead, I drove directly to the private residential address Mr. Caldwell had discreetly slipped into my hand 3 days earlier. It was past 8 in the evening when I pulled up to his modest brick townhouse on a quiet, tree-lined street. He opened the heavy wooden door before I even knocked, his sharp eyes scanning the empty sidewalk behind me, to ensure I had not been followed. I stepped inside his dimly lit study and dropped the silver flash drive along with a thick stack of printed documents onto his polished antique desk. I told him to look at what Trevor had actually built with my stolen money. Caldwell plugged the drive into his secure laptop. I sat in a leather wingback chair and watched his normally stoic professional face cycle through sheer shock, utter disbelief, and finally profound legal admiration. He clicked through the master property deeds, the state tax filings, and the corporate registration documents Jackson had provided. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath that ruffled the papers on his desk. Trevor was a brilliant criminal, but an absolute fool, Caldwell muttered, shaking his head as he stared at the screen. He was so terrified of triggering a federal tax audit that he completely legally isolated himself from his own masterpiece. By registering this limited liability company solely under your Social Security number and naming you as the exclusive managing member, he inadvertently made you the absolute undisputed owner of a $15 million luxury estate. I asked Caldwell what this meant for the massive $1.5 million line of credit Trevor had taken out by forging my signature. I needed to know if I was still going to lose my house and my business to the bank by the end of the month. Caldwell smiled a thin, predatory smile that instantly put me at ease. It changes absolutely everything, he explained, turning the laptop so I could see the glowing financial summaries. Because the LLC is entirely in your name and currently appraised at 10 times the value of the fraudulent debt, we can legally leverage the estate's massive equity to instantly satisfy the bank. We can completely separate you from Trevor's financial crimes without you losing a single leaf in your botanical nursery. The bank does not care about the forgery if the debt is backed by a pristine $15 million commercial asset. You are not bankrupt, Jillian. You are one of the wealthiest property owners in this city. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of my new position settle into my bones. Then I told Caldwell to open the secondary folder labeled Event Logistics. I watched his eyes widen as he scrolled through Jackson's meticulously kept records of Harrison's illegal pre-sales. I explained how my deeply arrogant brother-in-law had been aggressively selling luxury wedding packages for a venue he did not legally own and had no authority to operate. I pointed to the offshore routing numbers glowing on the screen, showing exactly how Harrison had funneled over $2 million in cash deposits into private shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. He had stolen the operating capital, leaving the estate completely broke and unable to hire catering staff, security teams, or floral designers to actually host a single one of these million-dollar events. This is massive federal wire fraud, Caldwell stated, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. Harrison is soliciting millions of dollars across state lines under the guise of a corporate entity he has absolutely no legal authority to represent. He is actively stealing from some of the wealthiest, most litigious families on the East Coast. This is not a simple family dispute over a deed. This is a multi-million-dollar federal crime that carries a severe mandatory prison sentence. I reached for my phone, ready to dial the police right then and there. I told Caldwell I wanted them arrested tonight. I wanted Francine to watch her precious golden child led out of his luxury city penthouse in handcuffs. I wanted the authorities to raid their homes and seize their assets immediately to pay for the sheer psychological torture they had put me through since my husband died. Caldwell reached across the desk and firmly placed his large hand over my phone. He shook his head, warning me to stop. "If you call the authorities right now, Harrison will panic," Caldwell advised, strictly keeping his voice low and urgent. "He will instantly realize someone leaked the real books. Harrison will immediately scramble those offshore accounts, digitize the funds through untraceable crypto tumblers, and destroy the digital trail before the federal investigators can secure the proper warrants. The money will disappear forever." Caldwell leaned closer, his eyes intense and calculating. "And if he destroys the evidence, he will claim Trevor orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme before he died. He will say he was just an innocent, grieving brother following Trevor's instructions. He will point to the fact that your name is on the LLC, and he will let you take the fall for the missing $2 million. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Harrison was fully prepared to frame me for a federal crime to save his own skin. I asked Caldwell what we were supposed to do to stop him from getting away with it. Caldwell tapped his index finger against the printed copy of the quitclaim deed Francine had ordered me to sign. We need them to commit to the fraud publicly, Caldwell advised. We need them on the official legal record claiming absolute ownership and total operational control of the venue and its finances. Francine and Harrison summoned you to their lawyer's office tomorrow at noon to sign this deed. They think they have you completely cornered. They think your business is dying because of Francine's sabotage, and they think you are desperate enough to sign anything just to escape the debt. I stared at the thick stack of evidence sitting on the desk. You want me to play the defeated widow? I asked, a cold, thrilling sense of anticipation washing over my entire body. Caldwell nodded, handing me back my phone. I want you to walk into the Lion's Den tomorrow and deliver the performance of a lifetime. Let Francine gloat about ruining your nursery. Let Harrison brag about his brilliant new wedding venue. Let them put their demands on the official record with their own highly paid aggressive corporate attorney sitting right there as a sworn legal witness. We need them to arrogantly admit that they are running the business and collecting the funds. Once they legally attach themselves to the operation of that estate, we will drop the hammer. We will hand this entire dossier over to the federal prosecutor and let the government do the rest. I looked down at Francine's threatening text message still visible on my lock screen. I thought about the sheer cruelty she had inflicted upon me while I was actively mourning the man I thought I loved. I thought about Vanessa mocking me in the sunken lounge and Harrison sipping stolen champagne while treating me like a pathetic burden. They had systematically tried to break my spirit and ruin my life to cover up their own massive failures. I locked my screen and looked back up at Caldwell. The fear that had controlled my life for the past week was entirely gone. I was ready to walk into that law office and give them exactly what they deserved. I told Caldwell to prepare the final documents. I was going to tear their entire world apart. The morning sun glared harshly off the towering glass facade of the downtown corporate plaza. I sat in my parked car for a long moment, letting the dull roar of city traffic wash over me. I looked down at my outfit. I had intentionally chosen a faded, oversized gray sweater, worn denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed canvas sneakers. I pulled my hair into a messy, haphazard knot at the nape of my neck and wiped away any trace of makeup. The woman staring back at me in the rearview mirror looked exhausted, defeated, and entirely broken. She looked exactly like a naive florist who had just lost her husband, her business, and her mind. It was the perfect disguise. I grabbed my battered canvas tote bag, feeling the heavy weight of Mr. Caldwell's prepared documents resting safely inside. I stepped out of the car and walked into the grand marble lobby of the skyscraper. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to an execution block, but my heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calm. I was not walking to my death. I was walking into a trap of my own brilliant design. The receptionist at the high-end law firm took one look at my drab attire, and her professional smile instantly curdled into a mask of polite disdain. She did not offer me coffee or water. She simply pointed toward a set of massive frosted glass doors at the end of a long, silent hallway. I kept my shoulders slumped and my eyes cast downward as I walked the length of the corridor, pushing the heavy door open with a hesitant tremble. The boardroom was an intimidating expanse of dark mahogany and sleek chrome bathed in the cold blue light of the sweeping city views behind the glass. Francine sat at the head of the massive table, looking like a predatory bird in a tailored white designer suit. Harrison slouched in the leather chair beside her, scrolling through his phone with a look of supreme boredom. Next to them sat a sharp-featured man in a dark pinstripe suit who I assumed was their aggressive corporate attorney. "Well, look who finally decided to join reality," Francine announced, her voice slicing through the chilled air of the room. She did not bother to stand or offer a greeting. She simply stared at me with undisguised, aristocratic contempt. "I told you yesterday, Jillian, you have absolutely no leverage left. I made 3 phone calls this morning, and now your botanical nursery cannot even secure a shipment of topsoil. Your vendors know you are a financial liability. You are completely insolvent." I remained standing near the door, gripping the strap of my tote bag with both hands. I forced my voice to tremble slightly when I spoke. "You ruined my business, Francine. I spent 10 years building that nursery, and you destroyed it in a single afternoon. I simply accelerated the inevitable, Francine replied, waving her manicured hand dismissively. Let us be honest with ourselves for once, Jillian. You were never meant for our world. You were a worthless placeholder for Trevor. He only married you because you were naive, trusting, and incredibly easy to manipulate. He needed someone foolish enough to blindly sign documents while he built his real legacy. You served your purpose, and now you are nothing but a liability to this family. Harrison let out a short, harsh laugh and tossed his phone onto the mahogany table. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. Do not take it personally, Jillian, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Trevor was a visionary. He knew this luxury estate was destined for me. He just had to use your pristine little credit rating to get the initial construction loans off the ground. Now the venue is finished, and it is time for the adults to take over the operations. I kept my head bowed, letting my hair fall forward to hide the intense, sharp focus in my eyes. I remembered Mr. Caldwell's strict instructions from the night before. I needed them to publicly commit to the fraud. I needed them to claim absolute ownership and operational control on the official record with their highly paid lawyer sitting right there as a sworn witness. But what about the weddings? I asked, my voice small and hesitant. Jackson told me there are brides calling. There are massive deposits. If I sign this over, who is responsible for the venue contracts? Harrison rolled his eyes and let out a loud, exasperated sigh. I am handling the operations, Jillian. I am the acting director of the estate. I have been personally managing the client accounts and securing the cash deposits for the past 3 weeks. The money is perfectly secure in our corporate accounts. You do not need to worry your pretty little head about the event logistics or the finances. I have complete total control over the entire operation. The aggressive attorney in the pinstripe suit cleared his throat and slid a thick stack of legal papers across the smooth surface of the table. This is a standard quitclaim deed and a full transfer of liability, Mrs. Estate, the lawyer stated in a brisk, impatient tone. By signing this document, you are formally relinquishing any and all claims to the 50-acre property, the luxury lodge, and the associated limited liability company. In exchange, my clients will generously assume the burden of negotiating the $1.5 million bank debt your late husband left behind. It is a highly favorable deal for you. It makes your little debt problem go away entirely. Francine leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. Consider it an act of charity, Jillian. We are saving you from total bankruptcy. Now stop wasting our valuable time. Sign the paperwork and hand over the master key fob to the management office. Harrison needs to get back to the estate to finalize the catering menus for our premier clients. I stared at the quitclaim deeds sitting on the table. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they did not even realize what they had just done. Harrison had just proudly confessed in front of a licensed attorney to operating a corporate entity he did not legally own and funneling millions of dollars in client deposits into secret accounts. He had claimed total responsibility for the fraudulent transactions. He had just handed me his own head on a silver platter. I took a slow, shaky breath. I let my shoulders drop an extra inch, projecting the image of a woman who had finally been entirely broken by the sheer weight of their cruelty. I walked slowly toward the table, my worn canvas sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor. I suppose I do not have a choice, I whispered, reaching into my drab tote bag. I pulled out a sleek black ink pen. Smartest thing you have said all week? Harrison sneered, tapping his fingers impatiently against the table. Just sign the bottom line and leave the keys. We have a lot of real business to conduct today. I did not reach for the quitclaim deed they had pushed across the table. Instead, I reached deeper into my canvas bag and pulled out the thick, heavy document Mr. Caldwell had finalized late last night. It was bound in a dark blue legal cover and stamped with the official seal of the State Commercial Registry. I placed my document firmly on top of their quitclaim deed. I uncapped my pen and signed my name with a smooth, elegant flourish, completely devoid of any hesitation or fear. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy electronic key fob Jackson had given me, and placed it directly on top of my signature. Then I placed my hands flat on the table, pushed my shoulders back, and stood entirely straight. I looked directly into Francine's eyes and let the facade of the defeated widow completely fall away. I slid the thick document across the mahogany table toward Harrison. The heavy paper stopped right in front of him. Harrison snatched the document eagerly, a victorious, smug smirk stretching widely across his face. He grabbed the key fob and tossed it into his pocket like a trophy. He was so eager to cement his victory that he did not even look at my sudden change in posture. He just wanted to see my signature surrendering the $15 million estate. But as Harrison looked down at the paper, his victorious smirk instantly vanished. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy legal pages shook in his grip. He blinked rapidly, staring at the bold black print on the very first page as if the words were written in a foreign language. "What is it?" Francine demanded, her sharp voice carrying a sudden note of genuine alarm. "Harrison, what did she sign?" Harrison could not speak. He just sat there, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as his eyes scanned the undeniable ironclad legal truth staring back at him. I watched Francine rip the heavy blue-backed document directly out of her son's paralyzed fingers. Her manicured nails practically tore the thick parchment as she yanked it across the mahogany table. She adjusted her designer glasses and began reading. I stood perfectly still, watching her eyes dart aggressively back and forth across the crisp, black text. The sharp-featured corporate attorney leaned over her shoulder to inspect the paperwork. His brow furrowed deeply as he scanned the legal seals, the watermarks, and the official state registry stamps that Mr. Caldwell had so meticulously prepared. The silence in the grand boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right before a massive explosion. Francine's jaw dropped. Her carefully maintained mask of high society elegance completely shattered, leaving behind an expression of raw, unadulterated panic. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and suddenly wild. The document I had just signed and handed over to them was not a quitclaim deed. It was a formal notice of eviction. It was a legally binding cease and desist order. And it was a mandatory, immediate termination of employment for Harrison from the estate. "What is this absolute garbage?" Francine shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "You signed the wrong paper, you stupid girl. This is a joke. This is some kind of pathetic, desperate prank." I placed both of my hands flat on the polished table and leaned forward. The meek, defeated widow act I had been playing for the last 20 minutes evaporated into thin air. I felt a surge of pure, intoxicating power course through my veins. "You do not own the property," I said smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "I do. I am the sole managing member of the LLC." Harrison finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic squeak. "That is impossible," he stammered, pushing himself back in his heavy leather chair as if the document on the table might physically attack him. "Trevor built that venue for me. It is my legacy. He put it in a shell corporation to protect it from you. You have no legal rights to that land." I smiled down at him, feeling nothing but cold pity. Trevor was terrified of a federal tax audit, Harrison. If he had registered a $15 million estate under his own name while possessing a history of failed business ventures, the Internal Revenue Service would have seized everything. So he hid behind my clean financial record. He forged my signature and registered the entire corporate entity under my Social Security number. Legally speaking, Trevor was just an unauthorized bystander. The state recognizes me and only me as the absolute owner of the estate, the vineyards, the Grand Lodge, and every single asset on that property. Francine slammed her hands down on the table, her face turning a vibrant shade of furious crimson. "This is a mistake," she screamed, standing up so quickly her chair crashed backward into the glass wall. "You are a worthless florist. You do not have the money or the intelligence to orchestrate a corporate takeover. I will hire a dozen litigators to tear this document apart. I will drag you through the federal courts for decades until you are completely bankrupt and begging me for a settlement. I will destroy your life, Jillian." The sharp-featured corporate attorney did not join her aggressive rant. Instead, he gently pulled the document away from Francine and read the second page very carefully. I watched the blood drain from the lawyer's face as he verified the state registry codes and the asset transfer protocols. He realized instantly that Mr. Caldwell had outplayed him on every conceivable legal front. The paperwork was flawless. I ignored Francine's screaming entirely. I kept my eyes locked solely on Harrison, who was now sweating profusely under the collar of his expensive custom suit. I leaned further over the mahogany table, bringing my face just inches from his. "If you step foot on my vineyard again, I will have you arrested for trespassing," I stated, my words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet spaces between Francine's hysterical threats. "I am changing the locks on the front gates. I am firing the private security detail you hired. And I am taking total operational control of the property, effective immediately." Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "You cannot run that venue," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You do not know the first thing about luxury hospitality. I have clients. I have contracts." I tilted my head slightly, feigning a look of innocent curiosity. "Oh, and Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I know about the $2 million in deposits you stole." The effect was instantaneous. Harrison physically recoiled, gripping the armrests of his chair as if he had just been electrocuted. His eyes darted frantically toward his attorney and then back to me. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from his body was magnificent to witness. Francine stopped screaming mid-sentence. She looked at her son, her aristocratic features twisting in sudden confusion. "What is she talking about, Harrison?" she demanded. "What deposits?" I did not let him answer. I pulled a single sheet of paper out of my canvas tote bag and slid it across the table directly to the corporate attorney. It was a printed copy of the encrypted spreadsheet Jackson had pulled from the secure server room. It showed the offshore routing numbers, the exact dates of the illegal transfers, and the IP addresses linking the digital theft directly to Harrison's personal devices. "Your client has been pre-selling luxury wedding packages for a venue he does not own," I explained to the lawyer, who was now staring at the spreadsheet in absolute horror. "He has collected $2.4 million in cash and wire transfers over the past 3 weeks. He did not deposit a single cent into the estate's operating account. Instead, he funneled every dime into a private offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands, leaving the venue completely unfunded and entirely incapable of hosting the events he sold." The attorney pushed his chair back from the table, holding his hands up in the air, as if the documents were physically contaminated. He looked at Harrison with an expression of pure professional disgust. "Are you committing federal wire fraud?" the lawyer asked, his voice completely devoid of any previous arrogance. "Are you using my firm to facilitate the interstate theft of millions of dollars?" Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stutter emerged. "I did not. It was just an advance on my inheritance," he managed to choke out, looking desperately at his mother for salvation. "Trevor promised me that money. I was just securing my future before she ruined everything." "You stole $2 million from some of the wealthiest families on the East Coast," I said, standing up straight and adjusting the strap of my tote bag. "You committed a massive federal felony, Harrison, and because you are not a registered member of the LLC, you committed that felony as an unauthorized rogue actor. The digital footprint points entirely to you. Jackson has secured the main servers, and my legal counsel has already prepared a comprehensive dossier detailing your entire embezzlement scheme." Francine reached for her son, her hands trembling violently. She finally realized the profound gravity of the situation. Her precious golden child was not just losing his stolen estate. He was facing a mandatory federal prison sentence. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden desperate pleading vulnerability. "Jillian." "Please," Francine whispered, all the venom completely drained from her voice. "We can fix this. We can quietly return the money. Just give us time to reverse the wire transfers. Do not call the authorities. He is your family." I looked at the woman who had spent the last week actively trying to destroy my livelihood and evict me from my home. I looked at the man who had treated me like a worthless peasant while stealing millions of dollars under the shield of my identity. "You are not my family," I stated coldly, turning my back on them. You are just a pair of pathetic criminals. I walked toward the heavy frosted glass doors, my footsteps echoing loudly against the marble floor. I did not rush. I took my time savoring the profound, stunned, panicked silence I was leaving behind in that boardroom. I pushed the doors open and walked down the long, silent hallway, ignoring the receptionist who was staring at me with wide, shocked eyes. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt entirely different than the ride up. My heart was not beating with anxiety or fear. It was beating with the steady, powerful rhythm of a woman who had finally reclaimed her life. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the warm air against my face. The oppressive, suffocating weight of my dead husband's lies had finally been lifted. I had won. I had beaten them at their own ruthless game. I walked to my car parked on the busy downtown street. I unlocked the door and tossed my canvas tote bag onto the passenger seat. I slid behind the steering wheel and let out a long, shaky breath, resting my forehead against the cool leather. The adrenaline was slowly beginning to fade, leaving me with a deep, profound sense of exhaustion mixed with absolute triumph. I reached into my pocket to pull out my keys. My fingers brushed against my phone. The screen was illuminated, displaying a new notification. It was an urgent marked email from Jackson. I unlocked the phone and opened the message, my sense of victory slightly faltering at the subject line. It simply read, "Emergency update, read immediately." I scanned the brief, clipped sentences Jackson had sent. My blood ran completely cold. The triumphant high I had been riding for the last 20 minutes instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, chilling spike of pure dread. Mr. Caldwell had been wrong. We thought confronting them with the irrefutable evidence of the wire fraud would force them into a panicked surrender. We thought the threat of federal prison would make them drop everything and run. We underestimated the sheer terrifying depth of Francine's ruthless ambition and Harrison's desperate greed. "They are not backing down." Jackson wrote his digital words, feeling frantic and rushed. Harrison just triggered a massive lockdown protocol from his phone. He transferred the remaining offshore funds into an untraceable crypto wallet and ordered the private security team to barricade the front gates of the estate. "They are not running, Jillian. They are doubling down. They are executing the second phase of Trevor's plan, and they are coming for you." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the harsh white light illuminating the dark interior of my car. Jackson's words burned themselves into my retinas. They were executing the second phase of Trevor's plan, and they were coming for me. My initial instinct, the ingrained trauma response from years of dealing with my husband's manipulative family, was to panic. I wanted to start the engine drive far away and hide until the nightmare simply disappeared. But the woman who would have run away died the moment I saw my name on that master deed. I picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Caldwell's private number. He answered on the second ring. I read Jackson's email aloud, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I told him Harrison had locked down the 50-acre property, hired private security, and transferred the stolen $2 million into a decentralized crypto wallet. I fully expected my attorney to express concern or advise immediate retreat. Instead, Mr. Caldwell let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. He told me that Harrison had just made the single most catastrophic miscalculation of his entire miserable life. "Harrison is acting out of pure, arrogant desperation," Caldwell explained, the sound of a leather chair creaking through the receiver. "He assumes you are a terrified, broke florist who cannot afford a protracted legal battle. He believes that possession is 9/10 of the law. By locking the gates and physically occupying the luxury lodge, he thinks he can force a stalemate. He expects you to drag him into civil court, where his highly paid attorneys can delay the proceedings for a decade while you slowly go bankrupt paying legal fees. He thinks he can bleed you out until you surrender the limited liability company just to make the pain stop." I gripped the steering wheel tightly. "But he does not know we already have his digital fingerprints on the offshore wire transfers," I said. "Exactly," Caldwell replied, his tone sharpening with professional anticipation. "He thinks this is a simple family dispute over a piece of real estate. He does not realize he has triggered a massive federal criminal investigation. By moving the stolen deposit money into a crypto wallet, he just elevated his crime from wire fraud to international money laundering." Let him lock the gates, Gillian. He is just building his own prison. The next morning, the true scale of Francine and Harrison's counterattack became sickeningly clear. I woke up to my phone buzzing relentlessly with notifications from local news outlets and elite socialite blogs. Harrison had initiated a massive aggressive public relations blitz. He was officially announcing the grand opening gala of the newly rebranded Blackwood Heritage Estate, scheduled for this very Saturday evening. I sat at my small kitchen table, drinking black coffee and scrolling through the polished digital invitations that were flooding social media. The sheer audacity of his strategy was staggering. Harrison had invited hundreds of the city's most elite residents. The guest list included local politicians, real estate tycoons, wealthy socialites, and powerful corporate investors. Even more horrifying, he had explicitly invited the dozens of frantic brides who had paid the massive cash deposits he had subsequently stolen. It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. Harrison knew he did not have the operating capital to actually host their upcoming weddings. By throwing a lavish, over-the-top opening gala, he was buying himself time. He was bringing the brides to the venue, getting them drunk on expensive champagne, and showing them a dazzling finished product to stop them from asking uncomfortable questions about where their money had gone. He was using the sheer weight of high society to legitimize his fake ownership. He firmly believed that if 100 millionaires clinked glasses on his manicured lawn, the property would become his by undisputed social decree. But Francine did not stop at securing the estate. She launched a simultaneous, highly coordinated attack on my personal sanity. By Wednesday afternoon, I began receiving cautious, pitying phone calls from peripheral friends and distant family members. My aunt, who I had not spoken to in 3 years, called to ask if I was taking my medication. A fellow small business owner from the Floral District left a voicemail suggesting a discreet psychiatric facility upstate. Francine had spent 48 hours working her extensive high society whisper network. She was spreading a vicious, beautifully crafted rumor that the grief of Trevor's sudden death had completely shattered my fragile mind. She told everyone who would listen that I was suffering from severe stress-induced psychosis. She claimed I was wildly delusional, running around the city telling people I secretly owned a $15 million luxury vineyard to cope with the reality of my failing nursery and my impending bankruptcy. She painted a picture of a tragic, broken widow who was completely detached from reality. Francine was systematically destroying my credibility so that when I finally tried to claim my rightful property, the entire world would look at me and see a crazy woman shouting at clouds. If I went to the police, they would see Francine's carefully planted narrative and immediately dismiss me as a grieving lunatic. The psychological warfare was suffocating. Every time I walked down the street, I felt the imaginary weight of 100 judging eyes. I felt the overwhelming urge to shrink away, to hide in my house and let them win. It would be so incredibly easy to just walk away and let the bank foreclose on everything. But I refused to be a victim in my own life any longer. I spent the remainder of the week locked inside Mr. Caldwell's office, mapping out the total destruction of the Blackwood family. We ignored the society blogs. We ignored Francine's whisper campaign. We focused entirely on the ironclad, undeniable truth of the master deeds and the digital ledgers. Jackson risked his own safety by secretly feeding us real-time updates from inside the locked estate. He provided us with the catering invoices Harrison was illegally charging to the empty corporate accounts. He sent us photographs of the massive delivery trucks bringing in thousands of dollars worth of rare flowers, imported champagne, and custom ice sculptures. Harrison was throwing a $500,000 party using credit lines registered under my limited liability company. Every single invoice he signed was another log thrown onto the blazing fire of his eventual prosecution. By Friday evening, the trap was perfectly and irrevocably set. Caldwell had coordinated directly with a contact at the federal prosecutor's office, handing over the comprehensive dossier detailing Harrison's international money laundering scheme. We possessed the signed quitclaim deed, proving their intent to extort. We had the official LLC documentation proving my absolute ownership. The only thing left to do was spring the trap while the entire world was watching. I was standing in front of my bedroom mirror, examining the outfit I had chosen for the gala when my phone rang. The screen displayed Jackson's name. I answered immediately, noting the tense, hushed quality of his voice over the line. He told me he was hiding in the maintenance shed near the edge of the vineyards. The estate was completely unrecognizable. Harrison had transformed the rolling green lawns into a sprawling luxury playground. Massive white silk tents were erected across the stone patios. A 12-piece string quartet was currently rehearsing in the Grand Lodge, and dozens of catering staff were rushing around carrying silver platters. It was the most expensive, opulent display of wealth Jackson had ever seen. "But that is not why I am calling," Jackson said, his gravelly voice dropping even lower. "You need to know what they have done at the perimeter. They are not playing around, Jillian." Jackson explained that Harrison had hired a specialized team of private security contractors to lock down the entire 50-acre property. They were positioned at the main wrought iron gates at every service entrance and patrolling the vineyard perimeters. "They have your photograph," Jackson warned, his words tight with genuine fear for my safety. "Francine personally briefed the security chief this afternoon. They printed out pictures from your social media and handed them to every single guard on the payroll. They are telling everyone you have had a severe psychotic break from grief. Francine instructed the guards that if you come anywhere near the property, you are to be considered highly unstable and potentially dangerous. She ordered them to physically restrain you and call the local police immediately." I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was not wearing faded denim or a scuffed, oversized sweater. I was wearing a stunning razor-sharp crimson dress that fit me like a suit of armor. My hair was styled perfectly and my makeup was flawless. I did not look like a broken widow, and I certainly did not look like a woman suffering from a psychotic break. I looked like a landlord preparing to evict a tenant. "If you show up here tomorrow night," Jackson pleaded, "they are going to publicly humiliate you. They are going to have you dragged away in handcuffs in front of the mayor and half the city council. Francine wants to make a spectacle of your breakdown. She wants the whole city to see you lose your mind. You cannot come to the front gates, Jillian." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The sheer mechanical precision of their cruelty was almost admirable. They had built a perfect, impenetrable fortress of lies, wealth, and private security. They truly believed they were gods among peasants. I adjusted the delicate gold chain around my neck and stared into my own cold, dark eyes. "Jackson," I said, my voice remarkably smooth and completely devoid of fear, "I want you to make sure the catering staff keeps the champagne flowing. I want you to ensure the string quartet plays loud enough for the entire valley to hear. I want Francine and Harrison to feel like they are standing on top of the world." But the security, Jackson interrupted, his voice laced with confusion. "They are going to keep you off the grounds." I smiled, a thin, dangerous smile that matched the crimson fabric of my dress. "Do not worry about the security, Jackson," I instructed firmly. "Let them pack the house. Let Francine invite the mayor and the press. Let Harrison boast to his wealthy brides. Let them build their stage as high as they possibly can. The larger the audience, the better." I ended the call with Jackson and dropped my phone onto the passenger seat of my car. The engine roared to life with a quiet hum, and I pulled out of my driveway, pointing my vehicle north toward the valley. The drive took exactly 40 minutes. I used every single second of that journey to bury the last remaining fragments of the naive, trusting florist I used to be. I was wearing a razor-sharp crimson designer gown crafted from heavy, sweeping silk that plunged elegantly at the neckline and hugged my waist like a second skin. It was an obscenely expensive garment. I had purchased it 3 hours ago, using the corporate platinum card tied directly to the estate's legitimate operating accounts. It was the very same account Harrison believed he had drained, but which Mr. Caldwell had instantly frozen and secured under my exclusive legal authorization. Buying that dress felt like a baptism. I was no longer a victim hiding in the shadows of my late husband's crimes. I was the undisputed owner of a $15 million luxury enterprise, and I was finally dressing the part. As I approached the winding private road leading to the Blackwood Heritage Estate, The sheer scale of Harrison's arrogant counterattack came into full view. A quarter-mile of luxury vehicles clogged the lane leading up to the main iron gates. Valets in crisp white uniforms were sprinting back and forth across the crushed gravel, opening the doors of sleek black town cars and imported sports cars. The Grand Lodge glowed against the dark night sky like a brilliant diamond. Massive white silk tents had been erected across the sprawling green lawns, illuminated by hundreds of floating fairy lights. The faint, elegant melody of a live string quartet drifted through the cool evening air, mingling with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck. Harrison had truly pulled out all the stops. He was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a single night, desperately hoping to cement his fake ownership through the sheer power of high society spectacle. I pulled my car straight up to the VIP valet lane, bypassing the long line of waiting guests. A young attendant rushed forward, opening my door. I handed him the keys and stepped out onto the gravel, letting the cool night breeze catch the edge of my crimson gown. Two massive security guards stood by the heavy mahogany front doors of the lodge, their hands crossed professionally over their dark suits. They wore earpieces and scanned the crowd with sharp, predatory eyes. According to Francine's explicit instructions, they were supposed to tackle me to the ground the second I set foot on the property. I did not break my stride. I walked directly toward them, the heels of my designer shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone pathway. As I approached, the guard on the left briefly locked eyes with me. He did not reach for his radio. He did not step forward to block my path. Instead, he subtly shifted his weight and smoothly reached out, pulling the heavy mahogany door open for me. Jackson had done his job perfectly. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the lion's den. The grand hall of the lodge had been completely transformed. The rustic wooden beams were draped in sheer white fabric and cascading orchids. Crystal champagne towers stood at the center of the room, surrounded by waiters carrying silver platters of caviar and truffles. The room was absolutely packed with the city's elite. I recognized local politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and influential corporate investors mingling under the glittering chandeliers. More importantly, I spotted several young women clutching the arms of their fiancés, looking around the room with nervous, excited energy. Those were the brides, the frantic, desperate women who had paid massive cash deposits to secure this venue for their weddings. Harrison had invited them here to pacify them, to show them a dazzling illusion of stability, so they would stop asking questions about their missing money. I glided through the crowded room, my crimson dress parting the sea of dark suits and pastel evening gowns like a knife. The quiet murmurs of the guests rippled around me as people turned to stare. I exuded an aura of absolute, undeniable authority. I was not the meek dirt digger who had stood trembling in a corporate boardroom just 24 hours ago. I was the master of this house. Across the grand hall, standing near a massive marble fireplace, I finally spotted them. Harrison was wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo, laughing loudly with a group of older, wealthy investors. Francine stood right beside him, dripping in diamonds and holding a crystal flute of champagne. She was actively holding court, soaking in the praise and admiration of the local high society bloggers. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from them, standing dead center in the middle of the room. I simply waited. It took less than 30 seconds for Francine to notice the shift in the crowd's attention. She turned her head, her polite high society smile firmly in place. Her eyes met mine. The crystal champagne flute slipped straight through her manicured fingers and shattered violently against the marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the hall, causing the string quartet to stumble and falter into a chaotic screech. Dozens of conversations died instantly. The entire room turned to look at the source of the disruption. Harrison spun around, his face flushing an ugly mottled red the second he saw me standing there in my designer gown. Francine recovered faster than her son. The shock on her face melted away, replaced by a mask of brilliant, perfectly calculated maternal tragedy. She saw the crowd watching and immediately launched into her rehearsed performance. "Jillian, my dear sweet girl," Francine cried out, her voice carrying loudly across the sudden silence of the grand hall. She stepped forward, holding her hands up in a gesture of absolute pity. "You should not be here. You are unwell. We talked about this. You need to be resting at the facility." I stood perfectly still, letting her project her false narrative to the captivated audience. Francine turned to the mayor and the local press, her face twisted in a mask of deep sorrow. "I am so terribly sorry, everyone. My poor daughter-in-law has suffered a complete psychotic break since my son Trevor passed away. The grief has completely destroyed her mind. She wanders around the city having these terrible delusions. She actually believes she owns this estate. It is a heartbreaking tragedy. She is a deranged, grieving woman who needs psychiatric help immediately." Harrison stepped forward, playing the role of the firm but sympathetic protector. He adjusted his velvet jacket and looked at me with a condescending sneer. "Jillian, you need to leave right now. You are scaring our clients. I am calling the medical transport team to take you back to the hospital. Do not make this any harder than it already is. You have humiliated yourself enough for one night." I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not defend myself to the crowd of whispering elites. I just smiled a slow, chilling smile that made the blood drain directly out of Harrison's face. The sheer, arrogant audacity of their lie was breathtaking. They were actively trying to convince a room full of millionaires and investors that the legal owner of the property was a raving lunatic. They wanted to strip away my credibility so completely that nobody would ever believe the truth about their massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. When I did not move or break down into tears, Francine's false pity vanished. Her eyes hardened into dark, furious slits. She raised her hand high in the air and snapped her fingers with a sharp, echoing crack. "Security!" she barked, her voice turning vicious and commanding. "Remove this deranged woman from my property right now. She is trespassing and she is highly unstable. Drag her out the back doors and do not let her back inside under any circumstances." The crowd gasped and instinctively stepped back, forming a wide circle around me. From the perimeter of the room, 6 burly security guards in dark tailored suits began marching forcefully across the marble floor. They moved with military precision, their heavy footsteps echoing ominously in the silent hall. Francine crossed her arms over her chest and smirked triumphantly. She looked at me with an expression of pure, vicious victory, fully expecting to watch me get dragged out of my own house, kicking and screaming like a hysterical madwoman. Harrison puffed out his chest and smiled at his investors, silently assuring them that the unfortunate distraction was being handled. The 6 massive guards reached the center of the room. They marched directly up to me, their broad shoulders blocking out the light from the chandeliers. Francine's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of pure malicious satisfaction. But the guards did not reach out to grab my arms. They did not attempt to drag me away. Instead, they walked right past me. In perfect unison, the 6 men spun around facing Francine and Harrison. They stepped backward, forming a solid, impenetrable protective perimeter directly behind my back and along my sides. They were not throwing me out. They were defending me. Francine's triumphant smirk instantly collapsed into a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Harrison staggered backward, bumping into the marble fireplace as a collective gasp of pure shock ripped through the crowd of elite guests. From the dark shadows beneath the grand, sweeping staircase, a tall, rugged figure stepped out into the light. Jackson walked calmly across the marble floor, passing straight through the protective wall of security guards. He stopped right beside me, his face set in a grim, determined line. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a live wireless microphone, and placed it firmly directly into the palm of my hand. I took the cold metal microphone from Jackson, feeling its solid weight anchor me to the present moment. I gave him a single sharp nod of gratitude. He tapped a small black earpiece, signaling the hidden audio-visual team we had discreetly positioned in the control booth 2 hours prior. The music cut off abruptly. The jarring screech of the cello strings halted mid-measure, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the grand hall. Every conversation stopped. Every crystal glass paused in mid-air. Every eye turned upward toward the grand staircase. I walked past Francine and Harrison, ascending the first 3 marble steps. I turned slowly to face the sea of glittering elite guests. Welcome to my property. My voice boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, echoing off the vaulted wooden ceilings and entirely shattering the illusion Francine had so carefully constructed. I hope you all enjoyed the champagne tonight, because it is the absolute last thing my former brother-in-law will ever serve you. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the massive crowd. I saw the city mayor exchange a bewildered, panicked glance with a prominent councilman. The wealthy socialites, who had been whispering about my supposed mental breakdown just moments before, now stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I did not look like a deranged, grieving widow. I looked like a queen standing in her own castle. Francine's face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer panic. "Turn off the microphone!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. "Security, remove this insane woman immediately. She is ruining the event. Throw her out into the street right now." The 6 burly guards standing at the base of the stairs did not flinch. They crossed their thick arms, forming an impenetrable human wall of dark suits between me and my furious mother-in-law. They had been briefed by Mr. Caldwell earlier that afternoon. They knew exactly who signed their paychecks, and it was certainly not the Blackwood family. "My sanity is perfectly intact, Francine," I stated calmly, looking down at her frantic, trembling form. "Unlike your son's legal standing," I raised my left hand, revealing a small black remote control. I pressed the primary button. Instantly, the 2 massive digital projection screens flanking the grand stone fireplace roared to brilliant life. They were supposed to display a rotating gallery of Trevor's original architectural sketches, framing him as a brilliant visionary. Instead, they illuminated the dark mahogany walls with the stark, undeniable reality of a certified state document. What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is the official master deed and the state commercial registry for the Blackwood Heritage Estate. I announced, my voice echoing with crisp, unwavering authority. You will notice that the sole managing member of the limited liability company, the exclusive owner of these 50 acres, and the only individual legally authorized to conduct any business on this property is me, Gillian Blackwood. Loud gasps echoed across the grand hall as the powerful investors squinted to read the glowing text. The state seals were bright, verified, and unmistakable. The legal jargon was plainly visible in massive black font. Harrison lunged forward, his velvet tuxedo jacket pulling tight across his shoulders. "That is a forgery!" he screamed, his voice cracking with high-pitched desperation. "She is a broke florist who lost her mind when my brother died. Cut the power! Somebody get to the control room and cut the power right now!" Francine hiked up her heavy designer gown and sprinted toward the narrow hallway leading to the audio-visual booth. But as she rounded the corner, Jackson stepped squarely into the frame of the doorway. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, blocking her path completely. He looked down at the furious matriarch with a deeply satisfying expression of utter boredom. "The controls are secure," Mrs. Blackwood Jackson said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying over the murmuring crowd without the aid of a microphone. "You are not touching a single wire tonight." Francine stumbled backward, her chest heaving, as she realized she was completely trapped. She was locked inside the very spectacle she had engineered to destroy me. I turned my attention back to the hundreds of guests staring up at me. I looked at the elite socialites, the powerful politicians who had blindly trusted the Blackwood name, and the young, anxious brides who were clutching their partners' arms in sudden rising terror. For the past 3 weeks, Harrison and Francine Blackwood have been executing a massive fraudulent campaign to seize control of a commercial asset they do not own, I explained, keeping my tone as professional and detached as a seasoned prosecutor presenting a closing argument. My late husband Trevor used my pristine financial standing to secure the massive construction loans for this estate. He registered the entire enterprise under my Social Security number to avoid his own federal tax liabilities. He built this beautiful venue, but he legally isolated himself from it entirely. It belongs to me. I paused, letting the heavy, unvarnished truth settle over the opulent room. The absolute silence was intoxicating. When Trevor died unexpectedly, his family realized they had absolutely no legal claim to the property. I continued, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the hall. Instead of accepting the truth, they attempted to extort me. They systematically sabotaged my botanical nursery, spreading vicious lies to my suppliers and actively choking off my business supply lines. They tried to financially starve me into surrendering this $15 million estate for pennies. Harrison was shaking violently now. The sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He grabbed a crystal champagne flute off a passing waiter's tray and hurled it blindly at the projector screen. It shattered against the stone wall, missing the screen entirely, but spraying sticky liquid and sharp glass across the polished marble floor. "Shut up!" he roared, his polished composure completely disintegrating into a pathetic animalistic tantrum. "You are ruining my opening night. You are ruining my legacy." "It was never your legacy, Harrison," I replied coldly. "You are just a trespasser in a rented tuxedo." I tightened my grip on the remote control. The true devastation was still waiting in the chamber. I looked out into the crowd, specifically seeking out the faces of the young brides I had spotted earlier. I saw a girl in a pale blue satin dress holding her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with mounting panic. I saw an older gentleman, a prominent venture capitalist, looking at Harrison with a dangerous, calculating glare. "I could have simply locked the gates and evicted them quietly," I said, my voice dropping an octave, commanding absolute total attention from every soul in the room. I could have let them walk away with nothing but their bruised egos, but Harrison decided to drastically escalate his crimes. He decided to drag completely innocent people into his desperate scheme to steal my property. I locked eyes with Harrison, watching the absolute terror finally register on his face. He knew exactly what was coming next, and there was absolutely nowhere for him to run. He had surrounded himself with his own victims. And for the brides and investors in the room tonight, I announced, pressing the button on my remote control one final time. You might want to look at this. The massive glowing screens behind me flickered and violently shifted. The official state deeds vanished, replaced by a sprawling, incredibly complex financial ledger. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, displaying thick red and green columns that highlighted every single transaction Harrison had executed since the day Trevor died. I pointed directly to the glaring red numbers highlighting the bottom of the spreadsheet. Harrison has been aggressively selling luxury wedding packages and commercial investment shares for a venue he has absolutely no legal authority to operate, I stated clearly, ensuring every single syllable resonated loudly through the hall. Over the past 21 days, he has solicited $2.4 million in cash and wire transfers. If you look at the columns on the screen, you will see the exact dates, the routing numbers, and the specific amounts of your individual deposits. A chaotic, frantic murmur immediately erupted from the crowd. People were pointing at the screens, desperately searching for their names or their corporate entity tags. The young bride in the pale blue dress let out a sharp, devastated cry as she spotted her $80,000 venue deposit glowing in bright, undeniable red text. "Now look at the right side of the ledger," I commanded, slicing through the rising panic. "Notice exactly where those funds were routed. Harrison did not deposit a single dollar into the estate's legitimate operating accounts. He funneled every last cent of your money into private offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. Earlier today, when he realized I was preparing to officially evict him, he transferred your deposits into a decentralized, entirely untraceable crypto wallet. He never intended to host your events. He intended to take your money and run." The grand hall absolutely exploded. The polite, refined murmurs of the elite crowd instantly morphed into a deafening, terrifying roar of pure outrage. The venture capitalist shoved his way violently through the crowd, marching directly toward Harrison with a face like thunder. The brides began shouting, demanding answers. The veneer of high society elegance was completely stripped away, revealing a mob of furious, defrauded victims demanding their money. "Where is my money?" Harrison, a man in a tailored tuxedo, bellowed, grabbing Harrison violently by the lapels of his velvet jacket. "I wired you $500,000 yesterday for the exclusive catering rights." Francine tried to intervene, pushing herself desperately between her son and the angry investor. "It is a lie!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she desperately tried to maintain her shattered aristocratic authority. "She hacked the system. The money is perfectly secure. We are the Blackwoods. We do not steal." But nobody was listening to Francine anymore. The glowing red numbers on the massive screens were absolute. They contained specific routing codes, bank transfer identification numbers, and digital timestamps that could not possibly be faked. I stood on the marble stairs, watching the complete beautiful destruction of their arrogant empire. They had tried to use the weight of high society to intimidate me into submission. They had invited these powerful people to act as their shield. Instead, they had unknowingly locked themselves inside a cage with their own executioners. I raised the microphone to my lips one last time, speaking over the chaotic, screaming crowd. My legal team has already forwarded this entire dossier, including the digital IP addresses, linking the crypto transfers directly to Harrison's personal devices, to the federal prosecutor's office. The authorities are currently securing warrants for your immediate arrest on charges of interstate wire fraud and international money laundering. I turned off the microphone and handed it back to Jackson, who had moved to stand directly beside me on the stairs. The look of quiet, fierce pride on the rugged operations manager's face was worth every single second of the nightmare I had endured. Harrison broke away from the angry investor, his velvet jacket torn at the shoulder, and made a desperate, pathetic dash for the main doors. He shoved past a terrified waiter, sending a tray of expensive caviar crashing to the stone floor. But he did not make it more than 10 feet. The heavy mahogany doors swung open violently from the outside. A half-dozen local police officers, led by two grim-faced federal agents in dark windbreakers, strode into the grand hall. They cut through the chaotic, screaming crowd with absolute authority, moving directly toward the frantic, sweating man in the ruined velvet tuxedo. The trap had finally snapped completely shut. The heavy mahogany doors swinging open did not immediately silence the grand hall. Instead, the sudden appearance of the federal agents acted like a spark thrown directly into a powder keg. The collective realization of what those badges meant washed over the elite crowd in a terrifying wave. The venture capitalist who had previously grabbed Harrison did not let go. He twisted the collar of Harrison's bespoke velvet tuxedo, lifting the younger man almost entirely off his feet. "Give me my $500,000 back, you pathetic little thief!" The investor roared, his face inches from Harrison's terrified eyes. The pale bride in the blue satin dress let out a blood-curdling shriek and lunged forward. Her fiancé tried to hold her back, but the sheer adrenaline of losing her $80,000 wedding deposit gave her unnatural strength. She swung her heavy, beaded evening bag, catching Harrison squarely in the jaw. The sickening crack of the impact echoed sharply over the chaotic din. Other investors surged forward, forming a tight, furious circle around the trembling, fraudulent director. They grabbed at his clothes, shoved his shoulders, and screamed demands for their stolen money. Harrison cowered, raising his arms to shield his face, sobbing openly, as his carefully curated high society peers transformed into a ruthless, vengeful mob. Francine could not reach her son through the impenetrable wall of enraged millionaires. She spun around, her aristocratic features contorted into a mask of pure demonic rage. She locked her wild, furious eyes on me where I stood calmly on the grand marble staircase. "You did this to us!" Francine shrieked, her voice tearing through her throat. "You disgusting, ungrateful parasite! You ruined my family!" She hiked up the heavy fabric of her white designer gown and charged the staircase. Her designer heels slipped slightly on the spilled champagne, but she caught her balance, driven by pure homicidal adrenaline. She lunged upward, her manicured hands hooked like claws, aiming directly for my face. "I want you dead!" she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "I will kill you myself!" I did not even flinch. I did not take a single step backward. Before Francine could reach the second marble step, the private security guards moved with lightning speed. The very same men Francine had paid top dollar to physically assault me seamlessly intercepted her charge. Two massive guards grabbed her arms, twisting them firmly but professionally behind her back. They lifted her entirely off her feet, dragging her backward down the steps. "Let me go," Francine thrashed, kicking her legs wildly in the air. "I pay your salaries. I am your employer. You work for the Blackwood family." One of the guards holding her arms leaned in close. "We work for the legal owner of this estate, Mom." the guard replied, his voice devoid of any sympathy. And the owner gave strict instructions to remove any hostile trespassers. The deafening wail of approaching sirens suddenly pierced the heavy oak walls of the Grand Lodge. The sound started as a distant scream echoing down the valley, before rapidly multiplying and magnifying until it felt as though the entire building was vibrating. The flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen local police cruisers cut through the darkness outside, casting frantic, strobing shadows across the frosted glass windows. The local authorities were arriving to back up the federal agents and secure the perimeter. The cavalry had finally arrived. Jackson handed the wireless microphone back into my hand. I gripped the cool metal and raised it to my lips. My voice easily cut through the wailing sirens and the chaotic shouting of the crowd. "You brought this entirely upon yourselves, Francine," I announced, looking down at the thrashing, humiliated matriarch. "I warned you to leave me alone. I begged you to let me grieve my husband in peace. But your greed was a bottomless pit. You wanted to completely destroy a broke florist so you could steal a $15 million property. You thought I was too weak and too stupid to fight back." I paused, letting the heavy truth settle over the horrified onlookers. "You thought you could force my hand tonight by throwing this ridiculous party," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute cold authority. "But you did not realize that while you were busy ordering custom ice sculptures and expensive caviar, my attorney, Mr. Caldwell, was sitting in a room with the federal prosecutor. We handed over every single piece of evidence earlier this afternoon. We provided the bank ledgers, the forged deeds, and the complete digital footprint of your offshore accounts. We knew exactly when Harrison panicked and transferred the deposits into the crypto wallet. That final transaction was the exact trigger the authorities needed to secure the arrest warrants. You built the perfect cage, and then you locked yourselves inside it." The crowd of furious investors slowly parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path for the two federal agents. They marched directly toward Harrison, who was now slumped against the marble fireplace, weeping uncontrollably into his hands. His velvet tuxedo was ripped at the seams, and his expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He looked utterly pathetic, stripped of every ounce of his false confidence and arrogant bravado. Harrison Blackwood, the lead federal agent, stated, his voice loud and authoritative. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, grand larceny, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." The agent grabbed Harrison's wrists, twisting them roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed brightly across the silent spaces between the wailing sirens. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Harrison dropped to his knees, his chest heaving with desperate, panicked sobs. "Mom!" he wailed, looking toward Francine with wide, terrified eyes. "Mom, please do something. Call the lawyers. Tell them I did not mean to do it. Tell them Trevor made me do it. Do not let them take me away." The security guards finally released their grip on Francine. She did not try to run. She did not try to attack me again. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor, landing directly in the puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal glass. Her pristine white designer gown soaked up the sticky liquid, instantly ruining the expensive fabric. She fell forward, resting her hands on the cold stone, and let out a guttural, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire dynasty burn to ash. Her high society friends, the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, stared down at her with undisguised, absolute disgust. The politicians she had funded turned their backs on her. The socialites she had gossiped with whispered harshly, pointing at her ruined dress and her weeping, handcuffed son. The federal agents hauled Harrison to his feet, dragging him forcefully across the grand hall. The local police officers had already flooded the lobby, standing by the shattered, frosted doors to ensure nobody interfered with the arrest. Harrison dragged his expensive dress shoes across the marble, leaving a pathetic trail of scuff marks as he sobbed and begged the arresting officers for leniency. He looked back at his mother one final time, his tear-streaked face catching the flashing red and blue lights of the squad cars parked just outside the lodge. "Mom, help me," Harrison screamed as they pulled him through the main threshold. But Francine could not help him. She could not even help herself. She was completely broken, trapped on her knees in a puddle of cheap champagne and shattered illusions. The wealthy investors she had courted were already forming a line to speak with the authorities, demanding restitution and providing witness statements regarding the fraudulent gala. The beautiful brides were crying in the arms of their partners, realizing the Blackwood name was nothing but a criminal syndicate. I stood on the marble staircase, bathed in the warm ambient light of the Grand Lodge. I looked out over the sweeping vineyards visible through the massive glass windows. The estate was finally entirely mine. The toxic parasitic family that had tried to bury me alive had just orchestrated their own spectacular public execution. I handed the microphone back to Jackson and offered him a genuine warm smile. He nodded, returning the gesture with a look of deep, profound respect. We had a massive mess to clean up. We had brides to refund, vendors to pay, and a reputation to restore. But as the police cruisers pulled away from the property carrying Harrison Blackwood toward a very long federal prison sentence, I felt a deep, permanent peace settle into my bones. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and the Blackwood legacy was finally dead. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air swept through the valley, bringing with it a profound and absolute silence. The frantic chaos of that grand gala, the screaming brides, the flashing police lights, and the shattered crystal on the marble floor all felt like a lifetime ago. That single night had crystallized into a turning point that fundamentally reshaped my entire existence. The wheels of justice, once set into motion by Mr. Caldwell's ironclad dossier, had crushed the Blackwood family with terrifying mechanical efficiency. Harrison's trial was shockingly swift and utterly merciless. The federal prosecutors did not offer lenient plea deals to a man who had defrauded dozens of innocent couples and wealthy investors while attempting to extort a grieving widow. The courtroom was packed every single day with the very people he had stolen from. I sat in the back row on the day of his sentencing, watching the arrogant golden child tremble in his seat. He was convicted of multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, grand larceny, and international money laundering. When the judge brought down the gavel, sentencing him to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, Harrison collapsed. The man who had worn bespoke velvet tuxedos and sneered at my floral aprons was now wearing standard-issue khaki. There would be no luxury catering, no high society galas, and no wealthy brides to manipulate where he was going. He was completely stripped of his stolen wealth, his unearned status, and his freedom. Francine's descent was arguably even more spectacular and far more poetic. When the federal authorities seized Harrison's bank accounts, the true staggering extent of their financial ruin became public knowledge. To keep her precious son from facing even harsher financial penalties, and to stave off the tidal wave of aggressive civil lawsuits from the defrauded brides, Francine was forced to liquidate absolutely everything she owned. I watched from afar as her sprawling suburban mansion, the absolute crown jewel of her carefully curated social standing, was auctioned off to a commercial real estate developer. Her designer gowns, her extensive diamond collections, her antique furniture, and her luxury vehicles were all mercilessly cataloged and sold to cover Harrison's exorbitant legal fees and court-ordered restitutions. The high society circle she had dedicated her entire life to cultivating dropped her instantly. In their ruthless, shallow world of appearances, poverty and public scandal were highly contagious diseases. Francine was officially blacklisted from every country club, charity gala, and socialite luncheon in the state. The women who used to drink her champagne and listen to her vicious gossip now actively crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with her. She currently lived in a small rented 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, utterly bankrupt and entirely alone. Her grand whisper networks had been permanently silenced. The only people who spoke her name now used it as a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. She had sacrificed her dignity, her morals, and her future on the altar of her golden child, and in return she had received absolutely nothing but total isolation. With the Blackwood family permanently removed from my life, I turned my full attention to the estate that had started this entire nightmare. The Blackwood Heritage Estate was undeniably beautiful, a breathtaking masterpiece of rustic architecture and manicured landscaping, but it held far too many ghosts for me to keep. I did not want to run a luxury wedding venue, nor did I want a daily looming reminder of Trevor's deceit and his family's cruelty. I wanted a clean slate. Mr. Caldwell, working with his usual quiet brilliance, brought me an offer I could not possibly refuse. An international luxury hospitality conglomerate looking to expand their exclusive vineyard portfolio had been quietly monitoring the property since the scandal broke on the local news. Once the legal title was confirmed unequivocally in my name and the federal investigations cleared the physical property of any criminal liens, they made their move. I sat in a high-rise corporate boardroom, a far cry from the dusty maintenance shed where I had first learned the truth and signed the final transfer paperwork. We closed the sale on a crisp Tuesday morning for exactly $25 million. The transaction was clean, perfectly efficient, and profoundly liberating. The moment the massive wire transfer cleared into my secure accounts, I executed the final phase of my personal liberation. I systematically paid off every single fraudulent construction loan Trevor had taken out under my name. I cleared the corporate credit lines, settled the outstanding vendor invoices Harrison had recklessly racked up for his fake gala, and legally dissolved the limited liability company Trevor had used to hide his financial sins. I watched the massive, suffocating debt that had threatened to ruin me evaporate into thin air. After the taxes and the debts were settled, I was left with a staggering surplus of wealth that secured my financial independence for the rest of my natural life. I was no longer chained to Trevor's cowardly mistakes. I was no longer a pawn in the Blackwood family's endless greedy games. I was entirely, completely free, but I did not take my millions and disappear to a tropical island. My heart belonged exactly where it always had, in the rich, dark soil, the tiny sprouting seeds, and the quiet, steady growth of my botanical nursery. I channeled a significant portion of my new wealth directly back into my true passion. The struggling little nursery I had fought so fiercely to save was now utterly unrecognizable. I purchased the 4 surrounding commercial lots, expanding our modest footprint into a massive, sprawling compound of state-of-the-art climate-controlled greenhouses. We transformed practically overnight from a small local supplier into a thriving, recognized national brand. We were now shipping rare hybrid orchids, custom-built terrariums, and exotic botanicals to high-end corporate clients and luxury event planners across the entire country. I walked down the main aisle of my primary greenhouse, the warm, humid air smelling deeply of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The automated irrigation systems hummed quietly in the background, sending a fine, cooling mist over rows of vibrant, healthy ferns. Dozens of my employees moved efficiently around me, tending to the bright green life that stretched as far as the eye could see. I was not wearing faded denim to hide my poverty anymore. I wore it because I loved the work. My hands were delightfully stained with fresh potting soil, and my hair was tied back in a messy, practical knot. I did not need designer crimson gowns or crystal champagne flutes to prove my worth to anyone. I had built a real tangible empire with my own 2 hands, nurtured it with my own sweat, and defended it with my own unyielding courage. Jackson walked through the heavy glass greenhouse doors holding a digital inventory tablet and smiling broadly as he watched a massive delivery truck load up our latest outbound shipment. When I had expanded the business, I had offered him the position of Chief Operations Manager. He had accepted immediately, bringing his fierce protective loyalty and his incredibly sharp logistical mind to my growing company. We had forged a permanent, unbreakable bond built in the dark trenches of survival, and I trusted him implicitly with my business and my life. He gave me a brief, respectful salute before heading off to coordinate the delivery drivers, leaving me alone with the quiet, rustling leaves. I paused by a row of rare blooming orchids, reaching out to gently trace the edge of a delicate white petal. The journey over the past year had been a grueling, brutal trial by fire. I had been lied to, manipulated, extorted, and pushed to the absolute breaking point of my sanity by the very people who were supposed to be my family. They had looked at my quiet nature and seen a weak, helpless, grieving widow. They had seen an easy target, a simple stepping stone on their ruthless path to unearned wealth and unbridled power. Francine and Harrison Blackwood had orchestrated a flawless masterpiece of psychological cruelty. They had engineered an intricate, calculated plot to strip me of my dignity, my livelihood, and my future. They wanted to leave me destitute and broken so they could continue living their grand, glittering lie. But they believed their own delusions of grandeur so deeply that they forgot the most fundamental rule of nature. When you try to bury something alive, you better make sure it does not know how to grow in the dark. In their arrogant, hasty desperation to save their precious golden child and maintain their hollow social empire, they had grossly miscalculated the strength of the woman they were dealing with. They thought they could step on me and walk away without a single consequence. They tried to bury me in a shallow, unmarked grave of debt and humiliation, not realizing they had handed me the very keys to their own total destruction.